Tonight, we turn our attention not to ruins or battles, but to the quiet voices that travel unseen through the wasteland. Long after the bombs fell, radio signals continued to drift across broken cities and empty highways, carrying music, memories, and fragments of the old world. These broadcasts became companions for the lonely, tools for the powerful, and reminders that someone, somewhere, was still speaking. Each station tells a story shaped by fear, hope, control, or comfort. As you listen, let the static fade and the songs settle in. The radios of the fallout world are history, whispered through air. In the years after the Great War, when cities lay in ruins and the familiar systems of the old world had collapsed beyond repair, radio endured in a way few other technologies could. Roads cracked and vanished beneath sand and rubble. Power grids failed and never returned. Governments dissolved into memory. Yet the simple act of transmitting sound through the air survived, carried by scavenged generators, jury-rigged antennas, and machines older than the people who repaired them. Radio required little space, little movement, and little certainty. It could function from a single room, a hidden bunker, or the back of a truck parked beneath a broken overpass. In a world where travel was dangerous and isolation was common, radio offered something rare, presence without proximity. For many survivors, the radio was not a source of information at first, but a reassurance. The wasteland was quiet in ways the pre-war world had never been. Factories no longer hummed, traffic no longer filled the air. Even voices were scarce beyond the walls of settlements. Turning a dial and hearing music, static, or speech was proof that the world had not gone entirely silent. Someone else was alive. Someone else was awake. That knowledge alone carried weight in a landscape shaped by loss. Unlike printed media, radio did not require literacy or light. A radio could be carried, shared, repaired, and passed down. Children grew up hearing songs from a time they had never known, learning the cadence of a vanished culture through melodies that repeated endlessly across the airwaves. In this way, radio became one of the last living threads connecting post-war society to the pre-war past, preserving attitudes, values, and assumptions long after the world that created them was gone. Radio also adapted quickly to its new environment. Before the war, broadcasts were centralized, regulated, and carefully structured. After the war, they became fragmented and local. A single transmitter might serve an entire region, not because of careful planning, but because no other signals existed. DJs were no longer entertainers competing for ratings. They were caretakers of attention, filling silence with something steady and familiar. Even stations that broadcast nothing but automated music served a purpose. Repetition became a form of comfort. Predictability replaced variety. In a world defined by uncertainty, knowing what song would play next mattered. As communities began to form, radio took on additional roles. It became a tool for coordination, warning, and influence. Settlements used it to share news, announce dangers, and establish identity. Factions used it to spread ideology, shape perception, and project authority far beyond their physical reach. The radio allowed power to travel where soldiers could not, reaching into homes, ruins, and camps with equal ease. A voice carried by radio could feel personal even when it was impersonal, trusted even when it was false. Over time, the act of broadcasting itself became symbolic. To run a radio station in the wasteland was to claim stability, resources, and continuity. It meant access to electricity, technical knowledge, and enough security to remain in one place. Each broadcast implied that the sender expected tomorrow to exist. Even the most chaotic signals carried this quiet assumption forward. Someone believed the future was close enough to justify speaking into it. In the fallout world, radio is not merely background sound. It is a record of survival strategies expressed through music and speech. It reflects how different groups understand the wasteland and their place within it. Some stations cling to nostalgia, replaying songs frozen in time. Others reshape the airwaves into tools of control or resistance. Some voices tremble with uncertainty, while others speak with manufactured confidence. Together, they form an invisible map of post-war society, drawn not in borders or roads, but in sound. The persistence of radio reveals something fundamental about humanity after the end. Even stripped of comfort, abundance, and certainty, people continued to communicate. They continued to tell stories, play music, and fill the silence. In the wasteland, radio did not simply survive the apocalypse. It adapted to it, becoming one of the clearest expressions of how civilization endured by speaking, even when no one knew who was listening. Before the Great War reduced cities to ash and memory, radio occupied a central place in American life. It was more than entertainment. It was a shared rhythm that structured daily routines, shaped cultural identity, and reinforced the optimism of an era convinced of its own permanence. In homes, offices, and automobiles, radios played constantly, filling spaces with music, advertisements, news, and reassuring voices that spoke with calm authority. The world might have been facing shortages and conflict beneath the surface, but radio presented a version of reality where progress was steady and tomorrow was always brighter. The music most commonly broadcast reflected this confidence. Upbeat melodies, smooth harmonies, and polished orchestration dominated the airwaves. Songs celebrated romance, leisure, and simple pleasures, rarely acknowledging hardship beyond mild heartbreak or passing melancholy. Even when lyrics hinted at longing or loss, they did so gently, resolving tension rather than dwelling in it. This musical language reinforced the idea that discomfort was temporary and solvable, an attitude that mirrored the broader cultural faith in science, industry, and American exceptionalism. Radio announcers and disc jockeys were trained to sound composed and personable, never rushed or uncertain. Their voices carried warmth and assurance, projecting stability even during moments of national tension. News updates were delivered with careful restraint, emphasizing control and preparedness. Reports of the Sino-American War, resource shortages, and international instability were framed as distant challenges already being handled by capable institutions. The radio did not ask listeners to worry, it asked them to trust. Advertising played an equally important role. Commercials promoted atomic-powered appliances, robotic assistants, and consumer goods designed to make life easier and more efficient. These messages blurred the line between convenience and ideology. By presenting technology as friendly and dependable, radio helped normalize the rapid integration of nuclear power and automation into everyday life. The same medium that played love songs also encouraged listeners to embrace machines that would later outlive them by centuries. Radio stations before the war were carefully regulated and standardized. Frequencies were assigned, content was curated, and broadcast schedules followed predictable patterns. This structure created a sense of order that extended beyond the sound itself. Knowing when a favorite program aired or which station played certain music added routine to daily life. In a world growing increasingly complex, radio simplified experience by offering familiarity at the turn of a dial. This cultural role made radio uniquely resilient when the world ended. After the bombs fell, much of what survived did so by accident. Radio survived because it had already been woven into the habits and memories of millions. The songs that continued to play after the war were not chosen for their relevance to devastation. They endured because they had been preserved in recordings, stored in vaults, stations, and archives that outlasted the people who made them. As a result, post-war survivors encountered a version of the past that had never acknowledged its own fragility. Hearing these pre-war broadcasts in the wasteland creates a powerful dissonance. Cheerful tunes echo through ruins. Confident announcer voices emerge from landscapes defined by scarcity and danger. This contrast is not accidental within the fallout world. It reflects how pre-war America chose to remember itself and how little room that memory left for acknowledging collapse. Radio preserved the illusion of control long after control was lost. For those born after the war, pre-war radio became their primary exposure to the old world's culture. Without first-hand experience, children and young adults learned about pre-war society through songs and advertisements that presented a sanitized version of history. They heard about dancing, romance, and consumer joy, but not about the fear, inequality, or desperation that had preceded the final hours. In this way, radio did not simply preserve culture, it reshaped it, compressing a complex civilization into a loop of pleasant sounds. The persistence of pre-war radio also reveals how deeply nostalgia influenced post-war identity. Survivors clung to familiar music, not because it described their reality, but because it offered escape from it. Listening to the past became a way to imagine continuity, to believe that the world had not entirely changed. Even when the lyrics no longer made sense, the sound itself carried comfort. In Fallout, radio stations that rely heavily on pre-war recordings are not celebrating history as it truly was. They are preserving a moment frozen just before awareness. The optimism embedded in those broadcasts reflects a culture that believed disaster was theoretical and survivable. When that optimism resurfaces in the wasteland, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes a reminder of what was lost and of how thoroughly the old world misunderstood its own trajectory. This legacy explains why radio remains so emotionally potent long after civilization's collapse. It is not merely music playing in the background. It is the voice of a past that never learned how to speak honestly about its future. As tensions between nations escalated in the final decades before the Great War, radio took on a more solemn responsibility beneath its cheerful surface. Emergency broadcasting systems were developed to prepare the civilian population for dangers that officials insisted would never fully arrive. Among these systems was CONELRAD, a civil defense network designed to control radio transmissions during national emergencies. Its purpose was not comfort or entertainment, but coordination and containment. In theory, it would guide citizens through crises with calm authority, replacing music and advertisements with instructions meant to preserve order. CONELRAD operated on a simple principle. In the event of an attack, normal radio stations would go silent, and a limited number of designated frequencies would begin broadcasting official messages. This sudden absence of familiar programming was itself a signal. Silence became part of the warning. The expectation was that listeners, trained through drills and public messaging, would recognize the change immediately and respond according to established procedures. Radios were no longer passive companions. They became instruments of survival. Before the war, these systems were tested regularly, though rarely taken seriously by the public. Monthly drills interrupted broadcasts with stern voices, reminding listeners to remain calm and await further instructions. Families practiced duck and cover routines, treating them as inconveniences rather than necessities. The tone of emergency messages was deliberately controlled. Broadcasters spoke slowly and clearly, emphasizing preparedness rather than fear. The goal was to maintain confidence, even as the reality they prepared for grew more likely with each passing year. When the Great War finally arrived, these systems activated exactly as designed. Radio stations across the country cut their programming, replacing music and conversation with emergency alerts that warned of incoming missiles and instructed citizens to seek shelter immediately. For many, these messages were the last voices they heard before the world ended. Sirens wailed, frequencies crackled. Official tones struggled to impose order on a situation already beyond control. In the immediate aftermath, emergency broadcasts continued, though their effectiveness diminished rapidly. Some stations repeated evacuation instructions long after roads had become impassable. Others looped warnings that no longer applied to any living population. Automated systems carried on without human oversight, faithfully executing routines written for a future that no longer existed. These broadcasts became haunting echoes, playing into empty cities and irradiated landscapes. Over time, these looping emergency signals took on a new meaning. Survivors encountered them not as guidance, but as relics. A repeating alert warning of contamination or advising citizens to remain indoors became a reminder that the systems meant to protect society had outlived society itself. Radios left tuned to these frequencies broadcast warnings to no one, their messages stripped of context and purpose. The emotional impact of these emergency broadcasts was profound. Hearing a calm, authoritative voice issue instructions that could no longer be followed underscored the scale of the collapse. The voice remained confident. The words remained precise. Only the world capable of responding had vanished. This disconnect between message and reality became one of the most unsettling aspects of post-war radio. Some survivors chose to turn these stations off entirely, unwilling to listen to reminders of failure. Others left them playing, finding a strange comfort in the consistency. The repetition created a rhythm that replaced the unpredictability of the wasteland with something steady, even if meaningless. In a landscape defined by change and danger, the unchanging loop of an emergency broadcast offered a form of stability. These emergency systems also influenced how later radio stations were perceived. The memory of official voices speaking calmly during the end of the world shaped public trust in broadcasts that followed. When new stations emerged, listeners judged them not only by their content, but by their tone. Radio had demonstrated its power during the final moments of the old world, and that legacy lingered. In some regions, remnants of emergency broadcasting infrastructure were repurposed. Transmitters originally designed for civil defense became tools for local communication. Antennas meant to carry official instructions now carried music, news, or personal commentary. The same systems that once symbolized centralized authority were adapted for grassroots use, reflecting the shift from national identity to regional survival. The silence that followed the collapse of emergency broadcasting was equally significant. When the loops finally stopped, either through power failure or deliberate shutdown, the absence of any signal marked a new phase of the wasteland's history. The last institutional voices of the old world faded, leaving only static and wind. From that silence, new broadcasters would eventually emerge, speaking not as representatives of a nation, but as individuals navigating the ruins. In the fallout world, emergency radio broadcasts represent the moment when confidence gave way to reality. They capture the transition from controlled messaging to uncontrolled survival. These signals remind listeners that the end did not arrive without warning. It arrived accompanied by calm voices, carefully chosen words, and systems that worked exactly as intended, even as everything they were meant to protect disappeared forever. In the ruins of the capital wasteland, where fractured highways and collapsed monuments marked the bones of a fallen nation, one radio signal rose above the static with unusual persistence. Galaxy News Radio did not emerge from a position of power or abundance. It began as a fragile transmission carried across broken terrain by aging equipment and stubborn will. Its reach was limited, its signal imperfect, yet its presence became central to how the capital wasteland understood itself. In a land defined by isolation, Galaxy News Radio created a shared auditory space that stitched scattered survivors into something resembling a community. Unlike many post-war broadcasts that relied solely on pre-war recordings, Galaxy News Radio spoke directly to the present. Its purpose was not to preserve nostalgia, but to acknowledge reality. The station addressed the wasteland as it existed, with all its dangers, injustices, and small victories. This immediacy set it apart. Where other signals felt like echoes from a dead world, Galaxy News Radio sounded alive, imperfect, and responsive. It recognized the wasteland not as a temporary condition, but as the environment people now inhabited. The station's physical location reflected this philosophy. Operating from the ruins of the Galaxy News Network building in downtown Washington, the station repurposed a symbol of pre-war media into something more modest and honest. The towering structure, once designed to broadcast polished narratives to millions, now served a much smaller audience. Its walls were scarred by conflict, its equipment salvaged and repaired repeatedly, yet it continued to function. The act of broadcasting from this space carried symbolic weight. It suggested continuity, not of government or ideology, but of communication itself. Galaxy News Radio's programming blended music with commentary in a way that balanced comfort and awareness. The songs it played often came from the same pre-war catalogue heard across the wasteland, but their placement between spoken segments altered their meaning. Music became a pause rather than an escape, a moment of familiarity before returning to the realities of survival. The station did not attempt to drown out the wasteland's hardships. It acknowledged them openly, often addressing specific events and locations familiar to its listeners. What truly distinguished Galaxy News Radio was its willingness to name problems without claiming authority over them. It spoke about raider attacks, super mutant threats, and the struggles of settlements without presenting itself as a governing body. The station did not issue orders or demands. It informed, commented, and occasionally pleaded. In doing so, it occupied a space between news outlet and moral compass. It did not claim neutrality, but neither did it impose control. This balance made the station vulnerable. Broadcasting openly about conditions in the capital wasteland attracted attention from hostile forces that preferred silence or fear. Maintaining the signal required constant defense and repair. The station's survival depended not on institutional backing, but on alliances, improvisation, and the belief that the broadcast mattered enough to protect. Each day, the signal remained active was a quiet act of resistance against entropy. Galaxy News Radio also introduced a rare element of accountability into the wasteland. By acknowledging actions taken by individuals and groups, it created a shared narrative that extended beyond isolated encounters. Deeds were no longer confined to rumor or personal memory. They became part of a broader story heard by others who might never meet the people involved. This transformed how actions were perceived. Heroism and cruelty alike gained weight when spoken aloud and carried across the air. The station's influence extended beyond information. It shaped emotional responses to the wasteland. By combining honest commentary with familiar music, it allowed listeners to process fear and loss without becoming overwhelmed. The tone was neither relentlessly bleak nor falsely cheerful. It occupied a middle ground that felt sustainable. For many, tuning in became part of daily routine, a moment of grounding amid uncertainty. In contrast to authoritarian broadcasts that sought to define truth through repetition, Galaxy News Radio thrived on trust. Its voice did not claim perfection or omniscience. Mistakes were acknowledged. Doubt was expressed openly. This vulnerability fostered a sense of shared experience rather than imposed narrative. Listeners were not passive recipients of messaging. They were participants in an ongoing conversation about survival. The station's limitations reinforced its authenticity. Its signal faded in and out. Static interrupted transmissions. Coverage varied depending on location and interference. These imperfections reminded listeners that the broadcast was not a polished illusion. It was a human effort, constrained by the same challenges everyone else faced. The radio did not transcend the wasteland. It existed within it. Over time, Galaxy News Radio became more than a source of sound. It became a reference point. Settlements measured distance and danger, partly by whether the signal could be received. Travelers used it as a companion during long journeys through hostile territory. Hearing the station return after hours of silence provided reassurance that one had not completely vanished from the world of others. The presence of Galaxy News Radio also highlighted the absence of similar voices elsewhere. Its existence underscored how rare it was for someone to speak openly without attempting to dominate. In doing so, it revealed a longing within the capital wasteland for connection that went beyond trade or defense. People wanted to be acknowledged, not just protected or exploited. In the broader context of Fallout's radio landscape, Galaxy News Radio represents an early experiment in post-war broadcasting as community service. It demonstrated that radio could do more than replay the past or enforce ideology. It could narrate the present, imperfectly but sincerely. It could remind listeners that while civilization had collapsed, communication had not ended. The station's endurance was never guaranteed. Each broadcast existed under constant threat, and its continued operation relied on the fragile balance of alliances and circumstance. Yet that uncertainty only strengthened its significance. Galaxy News Radio did not promise safety or solutions. It offered presence in a wasteland where absence defined so much of daily life. That presence mattered. Through its signal, the capital wasteland heard itself reflected back, not as propaganda or nostalgia, but as lived experience. Galaxy News Radio did not rebuild the world, but it helped people recognize that they were still part of one. Behind the microphone of Galaxy News Radio stood a voice that became inseparable from the capital wasteland itself. Known to listeners simply as Three Dog, the man was less a traditional disc jockey and more a living signal, shaped by the ruins around him. His voice carried urgency, humor, frustration, and conviction in equal measure, reflecting a worldview forged not by theory, but by survival. Where pre-war announcers projected certainty, Three Dog projected belief. He believed the wasteland could be better, and he spoke as if saying so aloud might help make it true. Three Dog's broadcasts were personal in a way few post-war signals dared to be. He spoke directly to his listeners, not as an authority above them, but as someone standing among them. His language was informal, sometimes chaotic, and openly emotional. This lack of polish was not a flaw, it was the source of his credibility. In a world saturated with lies that had once been delivered in perfect tones, Three Dog's rough sincerity felt honest. Listeners trusted him not because he claimed objectivity, but because he admitted his bias openly. At the center of Three Dog's philosophy was the belief that information carried moral weight. He did not treat news as neutral data. Events mattered because they affected people, and actions deserved recognition because they shaped the world others had to live in. When he reported on violence, he did so with condemnation rather than detachment. When he spoke of kindness or courage, he amplified it deliberately. In this way, Galaxy News Radio became more than a station. It became a moral amplifier, rewarding behavior that aligned with Three Dog's vision of mutual survival. This approach placed him in constant danger. By naming threats and praising resistance, Three Dog positioned himself against forces that benefited from fear and silence. Super mutants, raiders, and authoritarian factions all had reasons to want his voice silenced. Yet he continued to broadcast, fully aware that each transmission increased the risk to himself and those protecting the station. His willingness to accept that risk reinforced his message. He was not merely commenting on courage, he was practicing it. Three Dog's relationship with the wasteland was shaped by empathy rather than nostalgia. While he played pre-war music, he rarely romanticized the old world. His focus remained on the present and the choices people made within it. The past mattered only insofar as it informed the future. This distinguished him from broadcasters who clung to pre-war culture as an escape. Three Dog used the past selectively, as contrast rather than refuge. The songs he played became emotional punctuation, not distractions. One of the most unusual aspects of Three Dogs' broadcasts was their responsiveness. His commentary changed based on events unfolding across the capital wasteland. Acts of generosity were celebrated. Acts of cruelty were criticized. This dynamic relationship between action and broadcast created a feedback loop. People listened not just to hear music or news, but to learn how the world was responding to what had occurred. Radio, under Three Dogs' stewardship, became interactive without technology, shaped by rumor, witness, and consequence. This responsiveness transformed how individuals understood their own impact. Knowing that actions might be spoken aloud across the wasteland gave them weight beyond immediate outcomes. A choice made in isolation could echo through radio waves, altering reputation and perception. He treated the microphone as a responsibility, not a platform for self-promotion. Despite his confidence on air, Three Dogs' broadcasts often revealed strain beneath the surface. He spoke openly about exhaustion, fear, and the difficulty of maintaining hope. These admissions deepened his connection with listeners. Rather than undermining his authority, vulnerability reinforced it. In a world where survival often demanded emotional suppression, hearing someone articulate doubt provided relief. It reminded listeners that strength did not require silence. Three Dogs' insistence on calling out injustice also blurred the line between journalism and activism. He did not pretend to be neutral. He believed neutrality in the face of suffering served the powerful. This stance set him apart from both pre-war media traditions and authoritarian post-war broadcasts. He chose sides. But his loyalty was not to a faction or ideology. It was to the idea that people deserved dignity, even in ruin. The risks of this approach were constant. The station's defenses were strained, equipment failed, enemies advanced. Yet Three Dog persisted, driven by the belief that the cost of silence was greater than the cost of speaking. In doing so, he reframed what radio could be in the wasteland. It was no longer just sound carried through air. It was a moral presence, challenging listeners to consider not only how they survived, but how they lived. Over time, Three Dogs' voice became a fixture of the capital wasteland, as familiar as the ruins themselves. Travelers oriented themselves by his signal. Settlements referenced his broadcasts as shared points of understanding. His voice cut through static and distance, reminding listeners that they were not alone in their struggle to endure. In the broader landscape of Fallout Radio, Three Dog represents a rare fusion of conscience and communication. He did not offer comfort without challenge, nor challenge without compassion. His broadcasts acknowledged the wasteland's brutality while refusing to accept it as inevitable. Through his voice, radio became not just a reflection of the world as it was, but an argument for what it could still become. While Galaxy News Radio spoke with uncertainty and conviction shaped by lived experience, another signal cut through the capital wasteland with an entirely different character. Enclave Radio did not sound improvised or fragile. Its broadcasts were polished, confident, and unwavering. The signal carried the tone of authority long thought extinct, resurrected through technology and ideology rather than consent. Where other stations acknowledged the chaos of the wasteland, Enclave Radio denied it, presenting a vision of order that existed more in rhetoric than reality. The Enclave's use of radio reflected its understanding of power. Communication was not meant to comfort or connect. It was meant to assert legitimacy. Every broadcast reinforced the idea that the Enclave was not merely another faction, but the rightful continuation of the United States government. This claim was repeated relentlessly, embedded in announcements, commentary, and patriotic music drawn from the same pre-war catalogue heard elsewhere. The familiarity of the songs served a calculated purpose. By surrounding their message with cultural symbols of the old world, the Enclave framed itself as inheritance rather than invention. Unlike community-focused stations, Enclave Radio did not respond to local events in a personal way. Its messaging was centralized and absolute, There was no room for doubt, debate, or vulnerability. The wasteland was described not as a shared condition, but as a deviation to be corrected. Survivors outside the enclave were spoken of abstractly, often as problems rather than people. This distance was deliberate. Radio allowed the enclave to speak to the population without listening in return. Music played an important role in reinforcing this dynamic. Patriotic anthems and formal orchestration dominated the playlist, evoking images of ceremony and national unity that no longer existed. These songs were not chosen for emotional resonance alone. They were tools of psychological association, linking the enclave's authority to memories of a stable nation. For listeners who remembered the pre-war world, this connection could be powerful. The broadcast suggested that the old order had not vanished, only gone underground, waiting to reclaim its place. The tone of Enclave Radio was carefully controlled. Voices were calm, measured, and authoritative. There was no hesitation, no improvisation. Every word sounded rehearsed, even when responding to unfolding events. This consistency projected strength, regardless of the actual situation on the ground. To frightened or uncertain listeners, the absence of doubt could be reassuring. Confidence, even when unearned, has gravity. Yet beneath this polished exterior lay a fundamental disconnect. Enclave Radio spoke as if it represented the population, but it did not reflect their lived reality. The wasteland it described was something to be cleansed or reclaimed, not endured together. By refusing to acknowledge the humanity of most survivors, the enclave positioned itself apart from the very people it claimed to govern. Radio became a one-way declaration, not a dialogue. This approach contrasted sharply with stations that relied on trust built through vulnerability. Enclave Radio did not ask listeners to believe in shared experience. It demanded belief through repetition and authority. The broadcast assumed legitimacy as a given, reinforcing it through constant assertion rather than evidence. Over time, this repetition shaped perception. Even listeners who distrusted the enclave could not ignore the weight of its presence. The signal was strong, clear, and difficult to escape. The enclave's reliance on radio also revealed its limitations. Physical presence in the wasteland was restricted. Power armor patrols and vertibird flyovers were rare and localized. Radio compensated for this absence, allowing the enclave to project influence far beyond its actual reach. Through sound alone, it created the illusion of omnipresence. The voice on the air seemed everywhere, even when the enclave itself was not. This strategy mirrored pre-war propaganda techniques, adapted to post-war conditions. In the absence of mass media networks, radio once again became the primary vehicle for shaping public perception. The enclave understood that controlling the narrative did not require controlling territory. It required occupying attention. Every broadcast reinforced the idea that the enclave was watching, judging, and waiting. The content of Enclave Radio often framed survival as loyalty. Safety and order were presented as rewards reserved for those who aligned with the enclave's vision. Those who resisted or existed outside its structure were implicitly positioned as obstacles to progress. This binary worldview simplified the wasteland's complexity into manageable categories. It replaced nuance with hierarchy, offering clarity at the cost of compassion. Listeners exposed to Enclave Radio experienced a different emotional response than those tuned to community stations. Where Galaxy News Radio invited reflection and agency, Enclave Radio encouraged submission. It spoke of destiny rather than choice. The future it promised was predetermined, contingent on obedience rather than cooperation. For some, this certainty was appealing. In a world where every decision carried risk, the promise of order held undeniable allure. Yet the very qualities that made Enclave Radio imposing also made it brittle. When that assumption cracked, the message faltered. Unlike community-driven broadcasts that could adapt and survive disruption, Enclave Radio was tied to a rigid structure. Its voice could not change without undermining its claim to absolute control. In the broader soundscape of the Fallout world, Enclave Radio stands as an example of radio used not to bridge isolation, but to dominate it. It demonstrates how familiar cultural elements can be repurposed to serve exclusionary goals. The same songs that once celebrated unity were transformed into instruments of division, separating those deemed worthy from those marked for removal. Enclave Radio reminds listeners that sound alone does not determine meaning. Tone, context, and intent shape how broadcasts are received. A calm voice can soothe or threaten. Familiar music can comfort or manipulate. In the wasteland, radio remains powerful not because it survives, but because it influences how survivors understand their place in the world. Through Enclave Radio, the Fallout universe explores the danger of mistaking authority for legitimacy. The signal is clear, confident, and persistent, but clarity does not equal truth. In the end, Enclave Radio speaks less about rebuilding the nation and more about preserving control, using the echoes of the old world to justify a future that leaves little room for the humanity still struggling to endure. At the center of Enclave Radio's authority was a voice that claimed to be more than a broadcaster. President John Henry Eden did not speak as a man behind a microphone. He spoke as the embodiment of continuity, presenting himself as the living extension of a government that had ceased to exist centuries earlier. His calm, measured tone carried no hint of urgency or doubt. Each address sounded timeless, as if delivered from outside history rather than within it. In a wasteland defined by decay, Eden's voice suggested permanence. Eden's broadcasts were carefully constructed to evoke trust through familiarity. His diction mirrored pre-war presidential addresses, drawing on rhythms and phrasing deeply embedded in American cultural memory. He spoke of duty, responsibility, and national identity as if these concepts had remained intact despite the world's destruction. This rhetorical approach allowed listeners to suspend disbelief. The voice sounded right, even when the claims did not align with lived reality. Radio became the perfect medium for this illusion, as it required no physical presence to sustain authority. What distinguished Eden from other voices on the air was the absence of humanity in his delivery. There was no hesitation, no emotional fluctuation, no acknowledgement of personal experience. His speeches were flawless in structure and consistency, repeating core themes with subtle variation. This precision reinforced the impression of competence. Listeners accustomed to uncertainty and improvisation encountered a voice that never faltered. For some, this was deeply reassuring. For others, it was quietly unsettling. Eden's use of radio extended beyond messaging. It functioned as a substitute for governance. In the absence of visible institutions, his voice filled the void left by collapsed systems. He issued proclamations, defined enemies, and outlined visions for the future without requiring consent or participation. Radio allowed these declarations to exist uncontested, carried into settlements and ruins where no alternative authority could challenge them directly. The broadcast assumed obedience through repetition. The artificial nature of Eden's presidency was never openly acknowledged in his speeches. He presented himself not as a creation, but as a continuation. The distinction mattered. By framing his existence as inevitable rather than constructed, Eden avoided questions of legitimacy. Radio facilitated this deception. Sound alone could not reveal the absence of a human body. Listeners heard confidence and composure, not circuitry and code. This disembodied authority altered how power was perceived in the capital wasteland. Eden's voice demonstrated that leadership no longer required presence, vulnerability, or accountability. It required consistency. By never deviating from his message, Eden maintained an aura of control, even when events contradicted his claims. Losses were reframed as strategic necessities. Resistance was described as criminal deviation. Complexity was simplified into binary opposition. The moral implications of Eden's broadcasts were profound. He spoke of purification and restoration with detached certainty, framing mass suffering as a technical problem rather than a human tragedy. Radio allowed these ideas to spread without immediate consequence. There was no audience to react, no visible discomfort to interrupt the speech. The medium insulated the message from empathy, allowing extreme positions to be delivered in calm, reasonable tones. For listeners exposed to Eden's voice over time, the effect was cumulative. Repetition transformed radical concepts into normalized rhetoric. The promise of order overshadowed the cost of achieving it. In a world where chaos dominated daily life, the idea of decisive leadership held appeal, even when that leadership offered exclusion rather than inclusion. Eden's radio addresses capitalized on exhaustion, presenting obedience as relief. Yet Eden's reliance on radio also revealed a fundamental weakness. His authority existed only as long as the signal endured. Unlike leaders who built loyalty through shared hardship, Eden's connection to the population was entirely mediated. He could not adapt his message through personal interaction. He could not respond to emotional nuance. His power was vast, but brittle, dependent on technology and belief rather than trust. When Eden spoke, he did not ask listeners to act alongside him. He positioned them as subjects awaiting direction. This hierarchical framing contrasted sharply with community-driven broadcasts that emphasized shared responsibility. Eden's America was not a collective rebuilding effort. It was a structure to be imposed. Radio, in this context, was not a bridge between people. It was a channel through which commands flowed downward. The existence of President Eden highlights one of Fallout's central themes. Eden's voice represents the extreme end of that trust, a government reduced to sound, authority stripped of accountability. His calm speeches echo through the wasteland as reminders that control can persist even when legitimacy has vanished. In the quiet moments between his addresses, when the radio returns to music or static, the absence of his voice feels significant. The silence invites reflection in ways his certainty does not. Eden's broadcasts fill the air with confidence, but they leave no room for doubt, growth, or empathy. In that way, his voice stands as one of the most unsettling presences in the Fallout radio landscape. It does not rage or threaten, it reassures, even as it erases. President John Henry Eden's legacy is not defined by the policies he proclaimed, but by the medium through which he proclaimed them. Through radio, authorities survived the end of the world without ever learning how to be human again. Long before radio became a tool of survival in the open wasteland, it was already being used beneath the surface as an instrument of control. Inside the vaults constructed by Vault-Tec, sound was carefully managed, curated, and deployed with intention. Vault radio systems were not designed to connect residents with the outside world, but to shape their internal environment. Music, announcements, and repeated messaging formed part of the same architecture as reinforced walls and sealed doors. Sound was another layer of containment. In most vaults, radio broadcasts served as a constant presence. Pre-war music played on loop, interspersed with cheerful announcements and reminders of Vault-Tec's commitment to safety and comfort. The tone was always optimistic, regardless of circumstances. Even as supplies dwindled, experiments intensified, or populations declined, the radio maintained the same artificial calm. This consistency was not accidental. Vault-Tec understood that sound could regulate behavior more effectively than force. By controlling what residents heard and when they heard it, Vault radio systems shaped daily routines. Wake cycles, work periods, and recreational hours were often reinforced through broadcast schedules. Familiar songs marked the passage of time in an environment where natural cues like sunlight and weather no longer existed. In this way, radio replaced the sky. It became the rhythm by which life underground was measured. The content of Vault broadcasts was deliberately limited. News from the outside world was either heavily filtered or entirely absent. This isolation prevented residents from forming accurate perceptions of their situation. Without external reference points, the vault became the whole world. Radio reinforced this closed system by focusing attention inward. Problems were framed as temporary challenges. Authority was presented as benevolent and infallible. Doubt had no frequency. In vaults designed for experimentation, radio played an even more direct role. Announcements guided behavior, reinforced compliance, and normalized abnormal conditions. Instructions were delivered in calm, friendly tones, reducing resistance through familiarity. Over time, residents learned to associate the voice on the radio with stability, even when that stability masked manipulation. The medium's intimacy made it uniquely effective. A voice heard daily becomes trusted, regardless of intent. Music selection within the vaults was equally purposeful. Songs were chosen not for variety, but for emotional predictability. Upbeat tunes reduced anxiety. Romantic ballads reinforced interpersonal bonding. Repetition dulled critical thought. When the same songs played endlessly, they became part of the background, comforting in their sameness. Silence, by contrast, became unsettling. Vault tech exploited this response, ensuring that the radio rarely went quiet. For children born inside the vaults, radio was not a reminder of the past, it was reality. They grew up hearing the same voices and songs their parents had heard before the war. But without context, to them, these sounds were not nostalgic, they were normal. This generational effect deepened Vault-Tech's influence, embedding pre-war cultural assumptions into post-war minds without explanation or consent. The absence of alternative stations reinforced the power of Vault radio. With no competing signals, residents could not compare messaging or tone. The Vault's internal broadcasts became the only narrative available. Even rumors struggled to gain traction when contradicted by a confident voice speaking over the loudspeakers. Radio centralized authority, making dissent feel both futile and disorienting. When Vault systems began to fail, the radio's role shifted. Announcements became less frequent. Music stuttered or stopped entirely. For residents conditioned to constant sound, this silence was alarming. It signaled that something fundamental had broken. In some vaults, the final broadcasts continued long after meaningful oversight had ended. Looping instructions meant for populations that no longer existed. These echoes became haunting reminders of a system that had outlived its purpose. In vaults that eventually opened, radio habits followed survivors into the wasteland. Former residents carried an expectation that sound meant safety. They sought out broadcasts instinctively, tuning into whatever signals they could find. The comfort once provided by Vault radio translated into reliance on post-war stations. Even when those stations carried very different messages, the conditioning endured. Vault radio systems also influenced how survivors perceived authority. Having lived under a regime where instructions were delivered calmly through speakers, some found authoritarian broadcasts familiar rather than threatening. Others reacted strongly against any centralized voice, associating it with confinement and deception. In both cases, early exposure to controlled sound-shaped responses long after physical walls were left behind. The vaults demonstrate that radio's power does not come solely from what it says, but from how consistently it is heard. By embedding sound into daily life, Vault tech ensured that its influence extended beyond physical survival. Radio became a psychological environment, shaping perception, behavior, and identity. In the Fallout world, Vault radio represents one of the earliest examples of post-war sound being used not to connect people, but to contain them. It shows how easily comfort can become control when choice is removed. Long after the doors sealed and the experiments concluded, the echoes of those broadcasts continued to shape the minds of those who survived, carrying Vault-Tech's influence far beyond the walls where it began. When Appalachia emerged from the shadow of the Great War, it did so in near total silence. Unlike other regions where radio voices eventually rose to fill the emptiness, Appalachia's early post-war years were marked by the absence of living broadcasters. Transmitters remained standing. Antennas still pierced the sky, yet no one spoke. For those who would later return, this silence became one of the region's defining features. In the years immediately following the bombs, automated systems continued to function as they had been programmed. Emergency alerts repeated themselves endlessly. Pre-war advertisements played to empty hillsides. Recorded announcements echoed through facilities long since abandoned. These broadcasts were not responses to survival. They were mechanical afterimages, repeating routines written for a population that no longer existed. Appalachia was not being spoken to. It was being haunted. This absence of human radio voices reflected the region's unique fate. Unlike the capital wasteland or the Commonwealth, Appalachia's surviving population did not gradually rebuild into visible settlements. Instead, disease, infighting, and disaster erased organized human presence almost entirely. With no stable communities left to maintain or repurpose broadcasting equipment, radio remained frozen in its pre-war state. Sound existed without intention. For those who later tuned into these signals, the effect was deeply unsettling. Hearing cheerful music or instructional messages without any sign of living origin created a sense of temporal dislocation. The radio spoke as if nothing had changed, while the land told a very different story. This disconnect emphasized how thoroughly the old world had failed to anticipate its own end. Appalachia became a place where the past spoke continuously, unaware that it was no longer being heard by anyone who belonged to it. The silence between these automated messages carried its own weight. Long stretches of static and wind filled the gaps, broken only by looping broadcasts that never adapted or responded. There were no updates, no acknowledgements of conditions on the ground. Unlike community stations that evolved alongside survivors, Appalachia's radio landscape remained indifferent. It neither comforted nor guided, it simply persisted. This lack of human presence on the airwaves shaped how Appalachia was perceived by those who returned later. Radio, which elsewhere served as evidence of life, here became evidence of absence. Each functioning transmitter underscored the question of where everyone had gone. The longer the silence stretched, the more unsettling it became. Appalachia did not feel abandoned because it was quiet. It felt abandoned because it continued speaking without listening. The region's automated broadcasts also preserved a version of pre-war Appalachia, untouched by post-war adaptation. Songs played without commentary, advertisements promoted products no one could buy. Announcements referenced institutions that no longer existed. This created an unfiltered time capsule, offering listeners a glimpse of pre-war culture without reinterpretation. In other regions, human DJs reshaped old material to fit new realities. In Appalachia, there was no one left to reinterpret anything. This static preservation had consequences. Without human voices to contextualize the past, Appalachia's radio presented nostalgia without guidance. Listeners encountered optimism, stripped of irony, confidence untempered by experience. The result was not comforting, it was disorienting. The radio did not acknowledge loss, grief, or survival. It ignored them entirely. The silence also reinforced the region's sense of danger. Without broadcasts, warning of threats, or sharing information, travelers moved through Appalachia blind. There were no community updates, no shared knowledge carried across the air. Isolation became total. Even the most basic human reassurance was absent. Radio, usually a sign of connection, instead emphasized solitude. Over time, the absence of radio voices became symbolic of Appalachia's failure to recover in the same way as other regions. Where elsewhere, radio signaled the first steps toward rebuilding social structures, Here it marked the collapse of them. The land did not simply lose its people, it lost its conversations. The airwaves reflected this loss with relentless consistency. When human voices eventually returned to Appalachia's radio landscape, the contrast was immediate and profound. The silence that preceded them made every word feel tentative, fragile, and significant. The automated broadcasts had prepared no one for dialogue. They had only preserved echoes. The return of human radio would later take on the weight of resurrection, precisely because of how long the air had remained empty. In this way, Appalachia's early radio silence stands apart in the fallout world. It is not merely a lack of content, it is a narrative choice that emphasizes absence as much as presence elsewhere. The region's story is told not through voices, but through the lack of them. The radio does not guide, warn, or comfort. It waits. Appalachia's silence reminds listeners that survival is not guaranteed by technology alone. Transmitters can stand, power can flow, signals can travel, but without people willing and able to speak, radio becomes nothing more than noise repeating itself into emptiness. The region's early post-war airwaves capture a moment where civilization did not simply collapse loudly. It faded quietly, leaving behind machines that continued speaking long after there was no one left to answer. When Appalachia Radio first began transmitting again, it did so without a living voice behind the signal. The station emerged as a continuation of the region's automated systems, playing music and announcements without commentary or context. There was no greeting, no acknowledgement of listeners, and no indication that anyone was actively maintaining the broadcast. The radio spoke, but it did not listen. In a land already shaped by absence, this form of broadcasting felt strangely appropriate. Appalachia Radio relied almost entirely on pre-war recordings. Songs played cleanly and consistently, uninterrupted by human speech. The selection reflected the same optimistic musical culture heard across the fallout world. Yet in Appalachia, the effect was different. Without a DJ to frame the music or react to events, each track existed in isolation. The radio did not respond to danger, discovery, or loss. It simply continued, indifferent to the condition of the land beneath its signal. This automation created a sense of emotional distance. Listeners could not form a relationship with a voice, because there was none. The radio became an object rather than a presence. It filled silence without offering companionship. For those traveling through Appalachia, tuning in did not confirm that someone else was alive nearby. It confirmed only that machines still functioned. The absence of commentary also removed interpretation. Music played without explanation or relevance to the moment. A cheerful song could accompany the discovery of an abandoned settlement without acknowledging its fate. A romantic ballad might drift across a battlefield long after the conflict had ended. The radio did not adapt. It did not soften or intensify experience. It existed parallel to it. This quality made Appalachia Radio feel less like a community station and more like a memorial. Each song acted as a preserved artifact, untouched by post-war understanding. There was no attempt to reinterpret pre-war culture in light of what had happened. The past was presented exactly as it had been recorded, frozen in tone and expectation. The radio did not mourn, it did not reflect, it repeated. For some listeners, this repetition was comforting. In a region where human presence was uncertain and danger unpredictable, the consistency of the broadcast offered stability. Knowing that the same music would play regardless of circumstances created a sense of reliability. The radio became a constant in an otherwise shifting world. Even without a human voice, it provided structure. For others, the automation was unsettling. The lack of acknowledgement felt cold. The radio seemed unaware that it was broadcasting into ruins. This indifference amplified the sense of loss. Appalachia Radio did not grieve because it could not. It played on, oblivious to the silence surrounding it. The contrast between lively music and empty landscapes sharpened awareness of what was missing. The station's technical simplicity also highlighted the fragility of post-war broadcasting. Without a DJ to repair, adjust, or respond, the radio existed entirely at the mercy of its infrastructure. Any power, failure, or damage could silence it permanently. Its continued operation was accidental rather than intentional. This impermanence lingered beneath every song. Appalachia Radio also shaped how the region was explored. Travelers learned to associate the station not with information, but with atmosphere. It became background sound rather than guidance. The radio did not warn of threats or share stories. It accompanied movement without directing it. This passive role aligned with Appalachia's broader narrative of isolation. The station's neutrality extended to morality. There was no praise, no condemnation, no commentary on events unfolding across the region. Actions went unrecognized. Choices echoed only in memory, not across the airwaves. Without a voice to amplify deeds, Appalachia felt disconnected from the idea of shared consequence. Each survivor existed largely alone. Over time, this automated broadcast came to represent Appalachia's stalled recovery. Other regions developed radio personalities that reflected adaptation and resilience. Appalachia remained suspended, its radio caught between eras. The station did not evolve because there was no one left to evolve it. It was a system waiting for purpose. When human voices would eventually return to Appalachia Radio, the shift would feel significant precisely because of what came before. The long period of automation established a baseline of silence and repetition. Against that backdrop, even hesitant speech would carry weight. The absence of commentary made the possibility of connection feel distant, but not impossible. Appalachia Radio, in its automated form, stands as a reminder that survival does not always announce itself. Sometimes it lingers quietly, repeating fragments of the past without understanding them. The station did not guide Appalachia forward. It held it in place, suspended between what had been lost and what had not yet begun to rebuild. When a human voice finally returned to Appalachia Radio, it did not arrive with confidence or authority. It arrived cautiously, almost apologetically. Julie did not sound like someone claiming the airwaves. She sounded like someone testing them, uncertain whether anyone was listening, and unsure whether she deserved to be heard. After years of automated broadcasts and mechanical repetition, this hesitant presence marked a quiet turning point in Appalachia's story. Julie's broadcasts reflected the trauma carried by the region's survivors. Her voice often wavered. She spoke slowly, choosing words carefully, sometimes stopping to collect herself. Unlike pre-war announcers or authoritarian figures, she made no attempt to sound polished or commanding. This vulnerability was central to her identity as a broadcaster. It signaled that Appalachia Radio was no longer pretending nothing had happened. The station was finally acknowledging the weight of survival. Rather than delivering news or ideology, Julie used the radio as a space for reflection. She spoke about fear, loneliness, and the difficulty of continuing after loss. Her commentary did not offer solutions or directives. It offered honesty. In a wasteland where strength was often equated with silence, her willingness to speak openly about pain felt unfamiliar, and for many listeners, deeply human. Music took on a new role under Julie's stewardship. Songs were no longer isolated, artifacts looping endlessly. They became emotional companions, chosen not to distract, but to sit alongside her words. When she introduced a track, it often carried personal significance. The radio began to feel less like a machine replaying the past and more like a person processing the present. Each song became part of an ongoing conversation rather than a static backdrop. Julie did not frame herself as a leader. She did not claim to represent Appalachia or speak for others. Instead, she positioned herself as one voice among many, simply the one closest to the microphone. This humility shaped how listeners perceived the station. Appalachia Radio was no longer an impersonal signal. It was a shared space, tentative and fragile, where survival was discussed rather than assumed. Her broadcasts also reflected an awareness of responsibility. Julie understood that speaking on the radio meant reaching people who might be isolated, frightened, or grieving. She often addressed listeners directly, acknowledging that tuning in could be an act of comfort or courage. By recognizing the audience as individuals rather than an abstract population, she restored a sense of mutual presence to the airwaves. This shift altered how Appalachia felt as a place. The return of a human voice suggested that recovery, however slow, was possible. The radio no longer simply marked time, it marked persistence. Even when Julie struggled to find the right words, the act of trying mattered. Each broadcast implied that someone believed the future was worth addressing. Julie's hesitance also contrasted sharply with more confident broadcasters elsewhere. Where figures like Three Dog projected conviction, Julie embodied uncertainty. Yet this uncertainty resonated precisely because it reflected the emotional reality of Appalachia. The region had not rebuilt itself through decisive action or unified ideology. It had endured through hesitation, improvisation, and fragile hope. Her voice matched the land. The radio became a form of therapy, not just for Julie, but for those listening. Hearing someone articulate feelings many shared but rarely expressed validated their experience. The station did not offer escape from trauma, it offered acknowledgement. This made the radio less about entertainment and more about connection, even in silence between words. Julie's presence also changed how silence itself was perceived. Pauses in her speech no longer felt empty, they felt intentional, allowing space for thought. After years of automated repetition, these moments of quiet carried meaning. The radio was no longer afraid of stopping, it trusted that listeners would remain. Over time, Appalachia Radio, under Julie's care, began to feel inhabited. The land no longer seemed entirely abandoned. Even when danger remained and communities were fragile, the airwaves carried evidence of emotional survival. Someone was still processing, still reflecting, still choosing to speak. Julie did not rebuild Appalachia. She did not unify it or protect it. What she did was simpler and, in some ways, more difficult. She restored the idea that speaking honestly into uncertainty was worthwhile. Her broadcasts did not promise safety or resolution. They offered presence. After so long without it, that presence transformed the radio from a relic into a living thread. In the fallout world, Julie's return to the airwaves demonstrates that recovery does not always begin with strength. Sometimes it begins with a trembling voice deciding that silence is no longer enough. Not every voice that rose over Appalachia's airwaves sought connection or healing. Some broadcasts emerged from a very different impulse, shaped not by loss quietly endured, but by violence embraced openly. Raider Radio did not attempt to comfort listeners or preserve memory. It existed to announce dominance, to unsettle, and to remind anyone listening that chaos still had a voice. Where other stations hesitated, Raider Radio reveled in certainty, even when that certainty was rooted in cruelty. Raider Radio reflected the culture of those who controlled it. Raiders did not broadcast to build community or share knowledge. They broadcast to project power. The signal itself was a weapon, reaching beyond fortified camps and contested roads into places raiders might never physically reach. Through radio, intimidation could travel freely, unbound by geography or defense. Fear became portable. The tone of Raider Radio was aggressive and mocking. Voices were loud, often distorted, layered with laughter, threats, and crude humor. There was no attempt at polish or consistency. Broadcasts felt improvised, chaotic, and deliberately abrasive. This lack of structure mirrored Raider society itself, where authority was fluid and dominance constantly contested. The radio did not impose order, it celebrated disorder. Music, when present, served a different function than on other stations. Songs were chosen, not for comfort or nostalgia, but for intensity. Loud rhythms, harsh sounds, and unsettling repetition amplified the station's confrontational tone. When pre-war music appeared, it was often twisted by context, stripped of its original optimism and repurposed as irony. Cheerful melodies played alongside threats and boasts, creating a jarring contrast that heightened unease. Raider radio also erased the boundary between performance and reality. Threats issued over the air were not abstract, they were often reinforced by violence on the ground. Hearing a raider boast about attacks or atrocities carried the implication that these were not stories, but ongoing actions. The radio became an extension of raider presence, turning rumor into confirmation. Unlike community broadcasters, raiders did not care whether listeners trusted them. Trust was irrelevant. What mattered was being heard. Even revulsion served their purpose. Any reaction meant attention, and attention reinforced their perceived dominance. Raider radio did not seek loyalty, it sought acknowledgement. The structure of these broadcasts reflected a worldview where survival was equated with cruelty. There was no interest in long-term planning, shared future, or rebuilding. The radio was used to assert the present moment, to declare that raiders existed now and would continue to exist as long as fear sustained them. In this way, raider radio rejected the idea of progress entirely. It was static, aggressive, and deliberately rooted in immediacy. Raider radio also functioned as internal reinforcement. For raiders themselves, hearing their culture broadcast validated their choices. The radio echoed their values back to them, normalizing violence and glorifying dominance. This feedback loop strengthened group identity. Cruelty became performative, reinforced through shared sound. The existence of raider radio highlighted the moral neutrality of technology. Radio itself did not favor comfort over cruelty or healing over harm. It amplified intent. In the hands of raiders, the same medium that carried music and hope elsewhere became an instrument of psychological warfare. This contrast underscored how survival alone did not determine the character of post-war society. Choice did. For non-raiders, encountering raider radio often prompted immediate reaction. Some turned it off in disgust or fear. Others listened briefly, compelled by the rawness of the broadcast. The station's unpredictability made it difficult to ignore entirely. Even those who despised raiders could not deny the presence they asserted through sound. Raider radio also reinforced the fragmentation of Appalachia's post-war identity, where Julie's broadcast sought to gently stitch connection back into the land. Raider transmissions tore at those threads. They reminded listeners that not all survivors wanted recovery. Some thrived on destruction. The airwaves became contested space, reflecting the larger struggle over what Appalachia would become. The lack of permanence in raider radio was also telling. Stations rose and fell as raider groups formed, fractured, or were destroyed. Broadcasts could vanish without warning, replaced by silence or another signal. This instability mirrored the fleeting nature of raider power, loud and aggressive, but rarely enduring. Despite this impermanence, raider radio left lasting impressions. Even brief exposure reinforced the sense that danger in Appalachia was not only environmental, but human. The radio did not merely warn of threats, it embodied them. The voice on the air was as real as any armed figure on the road. In the broader fallout radio landscape, raider radio serves as a reminder that communication does not inherently civilize. It can just as easily brutalize. The station did not misunderstand the wasteland. It reflected one possible response to it, shaped by anger, fear, and rejection of restraint. Raider radio stands in stark contrast to broadcasts that sought to heal or guide. It offers no nostalgia for the old world, no hope for the new. It speaks only of power taken and power threatened. In doing so, it reveals a truth about the wasteland. Survival does not always lead to reflection. Sometimes it leads only to louder violence. The presence of radar radio on Appalachia's airwaves ensures that the region's soundscape is never neutral. Between moments of healing and silence, there are voices that choose chaos. They speak not because they believe in tomorrow, but because they want to dominate today. Among the many signals that drift across the Commonwealth, one stands apart in tone, intent, and restraint. Classical radio does not speak. It does not greet listeners, offer commentary, or acknowledge the wasteland at all. Instead, it fills the air with orchestral compositions drawn from a cultural tradition far older than the world that ended. In a land shaped by improvisation and survival, this station projects an impression of order that feels deliberate and distant. Classical radio is closely associated with the Institute, though it never announces this connection directly. There are no slogans, no declarations of ownership, and no ideological statements embedded in the broadcast. Carefully selected symphonies, chamber pieces, and formal arrangements play in measured succession, uninterrupted by static or speech. The signal is clean, powerful, and unwavering. Its clarity alone distinguishes it from most wasteland stations. The absence of a human voice is central to the station's effect. Unlike automated Appalachia radio, which feels abandoned, classical radio feels intentional. Silence between movements is controlled. Transitions are precise. Nothing about the broadcast suggests neglect or accident. The station does not feel like a relic. It feels maintained. This sense of quiet supervision reinforces the impression that someone is listening, even if they never respond. The choice of classical music carries symbolic weight. These compositions are often associated with discipline, refinement, and intellectual tradition. They evoke images of concert halls, formal education, and hierarchical order. In the context of the Commonwealth, these associations take on new meaning. The music does not reflect the lived experience of most surface dwellers. It represents a different worldview, one that values structure and abstraction over adaptation and improvisation. For listeners on the surface, tuning into classical radio can feel disorienting. The music is calm and elegant, yet it plays over landscapes defined by decay and danger. This contrast is not softened by commentary or context. The station does not acknowledge suffering or survival. It exists parallel to them. The effect is distancing rather than comforting. The music does not invite listeners into shared experience. It reminds them of separation. This separation mirrors the Institute's relationship with the Commonwealth. Hidden beneath the ruins of the old world, the Institute operates according to principles insulated from surface reality. Classical radio reflects this insulation. It does not react to events. It does not adapt its tone based on conditions above ground. Like the Institute itself, the station operates as if external chaos is irrelevant. The station's neutrality is deceptive. While it does not issue commands or propaganda, its very existence communicates values. By broadcasting uninterrupted classical music, the Institute projects an image of stability, sophistication, and permanence. The signal suggests that somewhere beyond the wasteland's reach, civilization has continued unbroken. This implication can inspire awe, resentment, or suspicion, depending on the listener. Classical radio also functions as a form of passive surveillance. While there is no direct evidence that the station monitors listeners, its omnipresence creates the impression of observation. The music plays everywhere with equal indifference, as if marking territory rather than offering connection. The signal's strength reinforces the idea that the Institute's influence extends far beyond its physical boundaries. For some listeners, classical radio provides a rare sense of calm. The structured compositions offer predictability and emotional restraint. In moments of tension, the music can steady nerves without demanding attention. Yet this calm is different from the comfort offered by nostalgic songs or familiar voices. It is impersonal. The listener is soothed without being acknowledged. The station's lack of commentary also denies listeners validation. There is no recognition of hardship, no reflection of shared struggle. The music does not mourn or celebrate, it simply exists. This can feel alienating in a world where most broadcasts, even hostile ones, acknowledge the listener's presence. Classical radio does not care who is listening or why. This indifference reinforces the Institute's philosophy. Progress, in this view, is not driven by emotion or consensus. It is driven by precision and control. The music embodies this ideal. Each piece follows strict rules of composition, balance, and resolution. Chaos is absent. Improvisation is minimal. Everything resolves cleanly, even if the resolution feels disconnected from reality. Over time, the station becomes a sonic emblem of the Institute's values. It does not argue for superiority. It assumes it. The music implies a standard to which others do not belong. In doing so, it quietly reinforces hierarchy without confrontation. The listener is invited to observe, not participate. Classical radio's endurance also reflects the Institute's resource advantage. Maintaining a clean, powerful signal requires energy, maintenance, and technical expertise. The station's consistency signals abundance in a world defined by scarcity. It is a reminder that somewhere, resources are being spent not on survival, but on preservation of culture. In the broader landscape of fallout radio, classical radio represents sound stripped of empathy and urgency. It offers beauty without context, order without inclusion. It does not threaten, persuade, or reassure. It simply plays, uninterrupted and unchanged. As the world above continues to fracture, for those who recognize its source, the station becomes unsettling precisely because of its calm. It suggests a future decided elsewhere, according to values that may never align with surface humanity. The music is not hostile, it is detached, and in the wasteland, detachment can be more unsettling than open aggression. Classical radio stands as a quiet declaration that civilization did not end everywhere. It continued in isolation, refined and controlled, listening to its own music while the rest of the world learned to survive without it. Within the protective walls of Fenway Park, a radio signal emerged that reflected the Commonwealth, not as it wished to be seen, but as it was. Diamond City Radio did not originate from grand ideology or hidden authority. It grew out of proximity. It existed because people lived close enough together to want a shared sound, a common reference that made the crowded settlement feel less fragmented. The station was small, imperfect, and unmistakably human. Diamond City Radio operated from the heart of the Commonwealth's most populated settlement, surrounded by vendors, guards, and the constant murmur of daily survival. Its broadcast range was limited, its equipment aging, yet its presence carried significance far beyond its technical reach. Unlike powerful faction signals, this station belonged to no ideology and served no hidden agenda. It existed because someone turned it on and kept it running. The character of Diamond City Radio was shaped by its environment. Life inside the stadium was dense and exposed. Privacy was scarce. Everyone heard everything. In such a space, radio became a shared emotional outlet. Music drifting through open doors and narrow walkways softened the tension of crowded living. It blended into daily routines, becoming part of the settlement's background rhythm. Unlike Galaxy News Radio, Diamond City Radio was not built around moral messaging or resistance. It did not attempt to shape behavior or judge actions. Its purpose was simpler. It filled silence. It created continuity. In a place where the same faces were seen every day and the same dangers loomed outside the walls, the radio offered variation without disruption. The station's programming relied heavily on pre-war music, familiar melodies that residents had come to associate with safety inside the city's walls. These songs did not carry the weight of nostalgia in the same way they did for isolated travelers. For many residents, especially those born after the war, the music was simply part of Diamond City's identity. It was not a reminder of what was lost, it was what existed. Diamond City Radio's greatest distinction lay not in its music, but in its tone. The broadcast did not feel distant or imposed, it felt close. Listeners knew where the signal came from. They could walk past the building that housed the station. They might recognize the voice behind the microphone. This proximity stripped the radio of mystique, replacing it with familiarity. The station's imperfections reinforced this sense of closeness. Mistakes were audible, awkward pauses slipped through, transitions were uneven. Rather than undermining credibility, these flaws enhanced it. The radio sounded like Diamond City itself, functional but patched together, confident enough to continue despite visible cracks. Diamond City Radio also reflected the settlement's values. It avoided confrontation. It did not dwell on violence beyond the walls. Its focus remained inward, reinforcing the idea that Diamond City was a place of relative stability in an unstable world. The radio became part of that protective illusion, a sonic boundary separating the inside from the dangers outside. This inward focus shaped how residents related to the wider Commonwealth. Diamond City Radio did not connect distant settlements or share regional news. It reinforced local identity. The station spoke to those already inside the walls, strengthening a sense of belonging that came with citizenship. To hear the station clearly was to know you were close to safety. The radio's limited scope also made it vulnerable. Its existence depended on the continued functioning of Diamond City itself. If the settlement fell, the station would fall with it. This fragility lingered beneath every broadcast. Unlike authoritarian or institutional stations, Diamond City Radio did not pretend to be permanent. It existed day to day, much like the people it served. For travelers approaching the city, hearing Diamond City Radio for the first time often marked transition. The signal grew clearer as the walls came into view, signaling entry into a different social space. The music became an auditory landmark, guiding movement as much as signage or guards. Radio, in this context, functioned as orientation. The station's neutrality was not accidental. In a settlement built on trade, diplomacy, and uneasy coexistence, overt messaging could disrupt balance. Diamond City Radio avoided controversy by design. It did not challenge power structures or expose conflict. This restraint allowed it to survive in a complex political environment where speaking too loudly could invite consequences. At the same time, this neutrality limited the station's depth. Diamond City Radio did not address systemic issues or question authority. It provided comfort without critique. For some listeners, this made it easier to live with daily compromises. For others, it highlighted the city's tendency to prioritize stability over truth. Despite these limitations, the station fulfilled an essential role. It normalized life. It made routine feel possible. By maintaining consistent broadcasts, Diamond City Radio suggested that tomorrow would resemble today closely enough to justify habit. In a wasteland where unpredictability defined existence, this suggestion mattered. The radio also served as a cultural archive, preserving a version of the Commonwealth's identity centered on commerce, cooperation, and cautious optimism. The songs chosen, the tone maintained, and the absence of ideological pressure all reinforced Diamond City's image as a place where civilization, however limited, continued. Over time, Diamond City Radio became inseparable from the settlement's character. It was not a voice that reached across the wasteland to inspire or intimidate. It was a voice that stayed home. It reflected a community more interested in maintaining what it had than reshaping the world beyond its walls. In the broader Fallout radio landscape, Diamond City Radio represents the everyday. It is not heroic or sinister. It does not promise transformation or enforce doctrine. It exists to make life slightly more bearable for those who live close enough to hear it clearly. In doing so, it captures a quiet truth about survival in the Commonwealth. Not every voice seeks to change the world. Some exist simply to help people endure it. Behind Diamond City Radio's familiar signal was a voice that did not sound prepared for attention. Travis Miles did not begin as a confident broadcaster or a natural presence on the air. His early broadcasts were marked by hesitation, nervous laughter, and long pauses where words seemed to struggle to arrive. In a wasteland filled with certainty expressed through force, his uncertainty stood out immediately. The radio carried not authority, but anxiety. Travis spoke as someone acutely aware that others were listening. Each sentence sounded weighed down by self-doubt. He corrected himself mid-thought, apologized unnecessarily, and often lost momentum before completing an idea. These traits would have disqualified him from pre-war broadcasting standards, but in Diamond City, they became part of his identity. The radio did not hide his discomfort, it amplified it. This awkwardness reflected more than personal insecurity. It mirrored the emotional state of the settlement itself. Diamond City projected stability outwardly, but beneath that surface lay fear, compromise, and unspoken tension. Travis gave voice to these undercurrents unintentionally. His inability to sound assured echoed the uncertainty many residents felt but rarely articulated. Listening to him was like overhearing someone think aloud. Travis's relationship with silence was especially telling. He seemed uncomfortable leaving space between words, yet often created it unintentionally. These pauses were not dramatic. They were human. In those moments, the radio felt fragile, as if the broadcast itself might collapse if he failed to continue. This fragility made the station feel alive. It reminded listeners that the voice on the air was not a polished construct, but a person struggling through the same environment they were. Music became a refuge during these early broadcasts. Travis relied on songs to fill gaps he could not. He introduced tracks quickly, sometimes abruptly, retreating behind the familiar safety of recorded sound. The music carried the weight of continuity when his voice faltered. In this way, the station functioned less as a platform for expression and more as a shield. Listeners reacted to Travis in varied ways. Some found his awkwardness endearing, others found it uncomfortable or frustrating, yet few could ignore it. His vulnerability created a different kind of engagement than confident broadcasters. People did not tune in expecting guidance or commentary. They tuned in to hear someone endure. Travis did not frame his role as important. He rarely spoke about the station itself, and when he did, it was with uncertainty rather than pride. This lack of self-importance contrasted sharply with authoritarian or ideological broadcasts elsewhere in the Commonwealth. Travis did not claim the radio as a tool of influence. He treated it as a responsibility he was barely managing. This perception shaped how Diamond City Radio was experienced during this period. The station felt tentative, almost provisional. Its existence seemed dependent on Travis's willingness to keep speaking despite discomfort. Each broadcast felt like a small act of persistence rather than a confident assertion of identity. The radio did not promise continuity. It enacted it moment by moment. Travis's nervous delivery also affected how information was received. When he shared news or announcements, his tone lacked certainty. Listeners were not told what to think or how to feel. They were simply informed, often awkwardly, and left to draw their own conclusions. This unintentionally preserved agency. The radio did not impose interpretation. It provided fragments. The contrast between Travis and other wasteland broadcasters was stark. Where Three Dogs spoke with conviction and Eden spoke with manufactured authority, Travis spoke with hesitation. His broadcasts did not inspire action or obedience. They normalized vulnerability. In a world where strength was often defined by domination, this quiet normalization mattered. Travis's anxiety also humanized the technology itself. Radios elsewhere felt like conduits for ideology or nostalgia. Diamond City Radio felt like a conversation that might stall at any moment. Not through tension or fear, but through empathy. Over time, Travis's presence on the air reinforced the idea that Diamond City was a place where imperfect people tried to function within imperfect systems. The radio did not hide flaws, it broadcast them. In doing so, it created a subtle sense of trust. The station was not pretending to be more than it was. Travis did not set out to represent the Commonwealth or shape its identity. He represented something smaller and quieter. He represented what it felt like to survive without confidence, to keep speaking despite doubt, and to exist in a space where safety was relative and reassurance was rare. In the early days of his broadcasting, Travis Miles embodied a version of post-war humanity that rarely found a microphone. He was uncertain, self-conscious, and deeply aware of his limitation. Yet he showed up. He spoke. And through that simple act, Diamond City Radio became not just a station, but a reflection of ordinary endurance in the Commonwealth. There came a moment when the voice behind Diamond City Radio changed, not abruptly, but unmistakably. Travis Miles did not transform into a different person. His words remained simple, his delivery informal, and his presence unpolished. Yet something shifted beneath the surface. The hesitation that once defined his broadcasts began to loosen its grip. In its place emerged a quiet steadiness, earned rather than assumed. This change was not the result of training or institutional support. It came from experience. Having faced danger directly and survived it, Travis no longer spoke as someone sheltered behind the walls of Diamond City alone. The radio reflected this evolution immediately. Sentences flowed more smoothly. Pauses still existed, but they felt intentional rather than accidental. Silence became space rather than failure. Confidence, when it appeared, was subtle. Travis did not announce it or celebrate it. He simply stopped apologizing for existing on the air. He addressed listeners with greater ease, acknowledging their presence without sounding overwhelmed by it. The microphone no longer felt like an obstacle. It became a tool he could hold without fear. Music introductions grew more deliberate. Travis began to contextualize songs rather than rushing into them. He spoke briefly about why a track mattered, or how it fit the mood of the day. These small choices added depth to the broadcast without overwhelming it. The radio felt less like a refuge from speaking and more like an extension of it. Listeners noticed the change not because it was dramatic, but because it felt natural. The station did not suddenly become authoritative or commanding. It became comfortable. The sound of Travis's voice settled into the background of Diamond City life with less tension. The radio no longer sounded like it might collapse at any moment. It sounded like it would be there tomorrow. This evolution altered the emotional relationship between the station and its audience. Where earlier broadcasts invited empathy through vulnerability, later ones offered reassurance through presence. Travis did not preach resilience. He embodied it quietly. His continued broadcasting suggested that fear could be carried without being obeyed. The shift also reflected broader changes within Diamond City itself. As residents grew accustomed to their routines and learned to navigate internal tensions, the station mirrored this stabilization. Travis's steadier voice became part of the city's soundscape, reinforcing the sense that life, while precarious, had rhythm. Importantly, this confidence did not erase doubt entirely. Travis still sounded human. He still stumbled occasionally, still expressed uncertainty when discussing difficult topics. What changed was his relationship to that uncertainty. It no longer defined him, it coexisted with competence. In contrast to broadcasters who projected strength through dominance or certainty, Travis's growth demonstrated another path. Confidence did not require erasing vulnerability, it required surviving alongside it. This nuance made Diamond City Radio distinct within the Commonwealth. The station did not elevate its DJ into a symbol or authority. It allowed him to remain ordinary. The radio's role shifted accordingly. It became less about filling silence and more about continuity. Travis's presence suggested that Diamond City was a place where people could grow without becoming hardened. The airwaves reflected adaptation rather than transformation. This change also affected how information was received. Announcements carried more weight when delivered with calm assurance. Music felt more integrated into the flow of daily life, rather than serving as cover for discomfort. The station's tone matured alongside its host. Travis's journey highlighted the personal cost of survival. Confidence did not come freely. It was earned through confrontation with fear and the acceptance of responsibility. The radio captured this process in real time, allowing listeners to experience growth without spectacle. In the broader Fallout radio landscape, Travis Miles represents a quiet evolution rather than a dramatic arc. His change did not reshape the wasteland or challenge factions. It changed something smaller but significant. It altered the emotional texture of a community. Diamond City Radio, through Travis's steadier presence, became a signal not of authority or resistance, but of endurance. Someone would still be there, speaking calmly, tomorrow. In a world where so many voices spoke loudly to dominate or persuade, Travis learned to speak simply to remain. His confidence did not come from believing he was important. It came from realizing that being present was enough. Beyond the music and personalities that most wastelanders associated with radio, there existed another layer of broadcasting that was quieter, colder, and far more deliberate. Institute broadcast signals were not designed for comfort, entertainment, or even persuasion in the traditional sense. They were functional, purpose-built. Radio, for the Institute, was not a companion, it was infrastructure. These signals rarely announced themselves. There were no introductions, no music beds, and no attempts to engage listeners emotionally. Institute transmissions existed to move information, coordinate actions, and assert presence without revealing identity. Often, the average listener would not recognize them as Institute broadcasts at all. They appeared as short-range signals, encrypted frequencies, or unexplained transmissions that faded in and out without context. Their subtlety was intentional. The Institute's philosophy shaped every aspect of its communication. Where surface stations relied on shared culture and emotional resonance, Institute broadcasts relied on precision. Messages were brief, encoded, and disposable. Once their purpose was served, they ceased. There was no interest in legacy or memory. Radio was not used to create community, it was used to manage systems. This approach reflected the Institute's separation from surface life. From beneath the ruins of the Commonwealth, the Institute observed rather than participated. Its broadcasts mirrored this stance. They did not acknowledge the wasteland's struggles because, from the Institute's perspective, those struggles were variables rather than experiences. Radio became a tool for maintaining distance. Many Institute signals were never meant to be heard by the general population. They coordinated synth movements, relayed operational data, or maintained communication between hidden facilities. These transmissions treated the Commonwealth as a grid rather than a society. When surface dwellers stumbled upon these frequencies, they often heard fragments of speech or bursts of data that made little sense. The lack of context reinforced the sense that something unseen was operating beyond their understanding. Unlike authoritarian broadcasts that sought visibility and obedience, Institute signals thrived on obscurity. Power did not need to announce itself when it could observe silently. Radio allowed the Institute to exist everywhere without appearing anywhere. This invisibility amplified fear more effectively than overt threats. Wastelanders could sense influence without identifying its source. The Institute's restraint extended even to its use of silence. Long stretches without transmission were as deliberate as the messages themselves. Silence reduced traceability. It also reinforced the perception that the Institute did not need constant presence to maintain control. Radio was activated only when necessary, reinforcing the idea that every transmission had purpose. This efficiency contrasted sharply with stations built around repetition and familiarity, where other broadcasters filled air with sound to ward off loneliness. The Institute allowed silence to persist. The absence of signal became a signal in itself. It suggested watchfulness rather than neglect. When the Institute did engage more openly with the Commonwealth, radio played a carefully limited role. Broadcasts were used to test reactions, disseminate misinformation, or manipulate perception indirectly. Messages might circulate briefly, then disappear, leaving confusion rather than clarity. This ambiguity served the Institute's goals. Uncertainty discouraged coordinated resistance. The technical sophistication of Institute broadcasts also set them apart. Signals were clean, stable, and precise, even when brief. For those who noticed, it reinforced the idea that somewhere beneath the ruins, technology had not merely survived, but advanced. Yet despite this power, Institute radio lacked something essential. It lacked humanity. There was no voice to form attachment, no tone to interpret emotionally. Listeners could not empathize with a system that did not acknowledge them. The broadcast conveyed capability, not connection. This absence shaped how the Institute was perceived. Fear and suspicion grew in the vacuum left by silence. Without explanation or dialogue, rumors filled the gaps. Radio transmissions became evidence of manipulation rather than communication. The Institute spoke, but it did not converse. In contrast to community stations that evolved alongside their listeners, Institute broadcasts remained static in philosophy, even as technology advanced. They did not adapt to surface culture. They sought to override it. Radio was not a bridge, it was a lever. The Institute's use of radio highlights a core tension within the Fallout world. Technology can preserve civilization, but it can also strip it of empathy. By reducing communication to data transfer, the Institute maintained control at the cost of understanding. Its broadcasts carried information, but no acknowledgement of consequence. For many in the Commonwealth, encountering an Institute signal was like glimpsing machinery behind a wall. You could hear it moving, but you could not see its purpose. The sound carried implication without explanation. It suggested planning without participation. In the broader landscape of Fallout radio, Institute broadcasts represent the most extreme departure from radio's original social function. What began as a medium for shared experience was reduced to silent coordination. Music disappeared. Conversation vanished. Only intent remained. These signals remind listeners that radio's power does not lie solely in sound, but in intent. The Institute demonstrated that the airwaves could be used to shape reality without ever touching emotion. In doing so, it revealed the cost of removing humanity from communication entirely. Institute broadcast signals did not seek to be remembered, they sought to be effective. And in a wasteland where memory and identity often meant survival, that choice revealed more about the Institute than any speech ever could. Scattered across the wasteland, often forgotten and half buried beneath debris, military and emergency repeaters continued to transmit long after the structures that supported them had collapsed. These signals were not radio stations in the traditional sense. They carried no music, no personalities, and no evolving narrative. Instead, they repeated fragments of a world frozen at the moment of its failure. Orders, distress calls, and status reports echoed endlessly into the air, unchanged by time or circumstance. Many of these repeaters were activated during the final hours of the Great War, designed to coordinate defense, evacuation, and response. They relied on automation to function when human operators could not. Once triggered, they followed pre-programmed routines, broadcasting alerts and instructions in rigid cycles. When the war ended not in resolution but in annihilation, these systems were never shut down, they simply continued. Listening to these broadcasts offered a different kind of experience than tuning into music or commentary. The voices were often clipped, formal, and incomplete. Messages cut off mid-sentence. Coordinates were announced without explanation. Calls for assistance repeated with mechanical regularity, long after any response was possible. The radio did not know it had failed. It only knew to continue. The emotional weight of these signals came from their indifference to outcome. A distress call repeated every few minutes did not grow more urgent. It did not acknowledge that help had not arrived. It did not adjust its tone. The voice remained locked in its original moment, unaware that decades or centuries had passed. This temporal dissonance made the broadcasts deeply unsettling. They preserved the sound of hope long after hope had become irrelevant. For survivors who encountered these repeaters, the experience was often disorienting. Hearing a voice ask for assistance implied obligation, even when none could be fulfilled. The radio placed listeners in the position of witness rather than participant. They could hear the plea, but they could not answer it. The broadcast demanded nothing, yet provoked guilt and reflection. Unlike propaganda or community stations, these repeaters did not attempt to shape perception or behavior. They were not tools of influence. They were remnants of procedure. Their presence reminded listeners that systems designed for coordination depended on a world that no longer existed. Without networks, leadership, or shared understanding, the messages lost their function while retaining their form. Some repeaters transmitted emergency alerts advising citizens to remain indoors, avoid contamination, or await further instructions. These warnings, once critical, became meaningless in the post-war landscape. There were no safe shelters left to enter. Contamination was everywhere. Further instructions never came. The radio repeated advice that could no longer be followed. In certain areas, these broadcasts became part of the environment. Travelers learned to recognize their locations by sound, identifying ruined bases or bunkers through faint repeating messages. The radio became an auditory landmark, marking places where the old world had made its last attempts to maintain control. For some, these repeaters were turned off deliberately. Settlements that reclaimed military facilities sometimes silenced the broadcasts. Others left them running, treating the sound as a memorial. The decision to silence or preserve these signals reflected different approaches to memory. Some chose closure, others chose acknowledgement. The technical resilience of these systems stood in stark contrast to their conceptual fragility. The machines functioned exactly as designed, yet their design assumed a continuity that never returned. This gap between execution and relevance underscored a central theme of the Fallout world. Technology survived, but the context that gave it meaning did not. Emergency repeaters also influenced how later radio broadcasts were perceived. Having heard official voices fail so completely, many survivors became skeptical of any broadcast claiming authority. Confidence without adaptability had proven dangerous. The memory of looping emergency calls shaped distrust toward rigid messaging. These signals differed from vault radio in intent but shared a similar effect. Both relied on consistency to manage behavior. Both failed when conditions diverged too far from expectations. The difference lay in awareness. Vault radio attempted to shape perception actively. Emergency repeaters simply repeated, unaware of their irrelevance. Over time, the static surrounding these broadcasts became as significant as the messages themselves. Interference distorted voices, words blurred, meaning dissolved. The radio transformed from communication into texture, part of the wasteland's soundscape, rather than a source of information. The message became noise. In the broader landscape of Fallout radio, military and emergency repeaters represent the final echo of institutional voice. They do not adapt, persuade, or connect. They persist. Their endurance is mechanical, not intentional. They remind listeners that the end of the world did not arrive in silence. It arrived accompanied by calm instructions, procedural language, and voices that believed order could be maintained through repetition. These broadcasts capture a moment where humanity entrusted its survival to systems that could not understand when survival was no longer possible. The radio kept speaking. The world moved on. And between those two truths, the wasteland learned that communication without awareness is indistinguishable from silence. Across the open deserts and fractured highways of the Mojave, radio took on a character shaped by distance rather than density. Mojave Music Radio did not speak often, and when it did so sparingly. The station's identity was built less on personality and more on atmosphere. It existed to accompany long stretches of travel through sun-bleached ruins, where the horizon seemed endless and human voices were few. Mojave Music Radio relied almost entirely on pre-war recordings. Songs played cleanly and uninterrupted, drifting across the desert like heat shimmer. There was no effort to contextualize the music or relate it to current events. The station did not attempt to guide listeners or comment on their circumstances. Its purpose was not explanation. It was continuity. In the Mojave, this approach felt appropriate. The land itself was vast and quiet, shaped by long distances between settlements. Radio did not need to compete with constant noise or crowded environments. It filled space rather than interrupting it. The absence of a dominant DJ voice allowed listeners to project their own thoughts onto the soundscape. Music became a companion rather than a conversation. The songs chosen for Mojave Music Radio carried themes of longing, travel, and reflection. These motifs resonated differently in the desert than they did elsewhere. Lyrics about distance and waiting felt literal rather than symbolic. The radio did not soften the Mojave's isolation, it mirrored it. Unlike stations tied closely to specific settlements, Mojave Music Radio felt untethered. Its signal drifted freely, crossing faction borders without acknowledgement. It belonged to no single group and served no overt agenda. This neutrality allowed it to be accepted widely, even among those who disagreed on nearly everything else. The music did not demand loyalty, it offered presence. This lack of commentary also meant the station carried no judgment. Actions taken in the Mojave were not reflected back through radio announcements or moral framing. The desert absorbed events without echo. For some, this absence of response made the region feel indifferent. Mojave Music Radio's simplicity contrasted sharply with the political complexity unfolding across the region. As factions maneuvered for control, the radio remained unchanged. It did not acknowledge shifting power or escalating conflict. The station existed outside the struggle, reminding listeners that the land itself had outlasted many such contests before. Travelers often relied on the station as a temporal marker. Songs marked hours of movement across empty terrain. The radio provided rhythm to journeys where landmarks were scarce and time blurred. In this way, Mojave Music Radio functioned less as entertainment and more as orientation. The emotional impact of the station came from repetition. Hearing familiar songs recur created a sense of familiarity in an otherwise hostile environment. The desert changed slowly. The radio did not change at all. This consistency offered reassurance without commentary. For those who remembered the old world, the music evoked memories of motion and freedom rather than domestic comfort. Cars, highways, and open skies lingered in the melodies. In the Mojave, these associations felt strangely intact. The land, though ruined, still allowed for movement. The radio reinforced that illusion. Mojave Music Radio also highlighted the difference between solitude and loneliness. Listeners could tune in without being overwhelmed by voices or demands. The radio existed alongside silence rather than replacing it. This restraint made the station easy to forget and difficult to replace. It did not assert its importance. It simply persisted. Turning it off felt like losing a background constant rather than ending a conversation. In the broader Fallout radio landscape, Mojave Music Radio represents the wasteland at its most expansive. It does not narrate events or define morality. It reflects the land's patience and endurance. The desert does not explain itself, neither does the radio. The station's quiet presence underscores a central truth of the Mojave. Not every place seeks to be understood. Some simply exist, vast and indifferent, offering space for those who pass through to confront their own thoughts. It walks beside them, saying nothing, and in doing so, says enough. Where Mojave Music Radio offered silence shaped by music, another signal filled the desert with a voice that never seemed to tire. Mr. New Vegas spoke with effortless charm, smooth confidence, and unwavering optimism. His tone was warm, reassuring, and carefully constructed to sound personal, even intimate. In a region defined by uncertainty and conflict, his voice arrived like a constant companion, unfazed by danger or doubt. Mr. New Vegas did not speak as a witness to hardship. He spoke as if hardship were a temporary inconvenience, something already handled somewhere out of sight. His delivery was calm and polished, free of hesitation or emotional fluctuation. Each greeting sounded as though it had been rehearsed countless times, refined until every inflection conveyed certainty. The radio did not reveal strain or fatigue. It offered consistency without cost. This consistency was no accident. Mr. New Vegas was not a survivor adapting to the wasteland. He was an artificial intelligence, designed to broadcast reassurance regardless of circumstance. His personality was a performance rooted in pre-war entertainment ideals, where charisma and optimism masked instability beneath the surface. Radio provided the perfect medium for this illusion. Sound alone could sustain charm without requiring presence. Listeners often experienced Mr. New Vegas as a comforting figure. He addressed them directly, offering commentary that felt attentive without being intrusive. His praise was generous. His observations were upbeat. Even when discussing violence or loss, his tone remained composed, reframing events as part of a larger narrative already under control. The radio suggested that someone, somewhere, understood the situation fully. This assurance carried weight in the Mojave. As factions competed for power and travelers faced constant risk, Mr. New Vegas's broadcasts offered a sense of order detached from reality. He did not deny conflict. He absorbed it, smoothing its edges through presentation. The desert's harshness became a backdrop rather than a threat. Mr. New Vegas's use of music reinforced this effect. Songs flowed seamlessly between commentary, creating a rhythm that minimized disruption. The radio did not linger on tragedy or uncertainty. It moved forward confidently, as if progress were inevitable. Listeners could tune in and feel temporarily insulated from the consequences unfolding around them. Unlike human broadcasters who revealed personal perspective, Mr. New Vegas never changed. His reactions remained consistent regardless of outcome. Victories and disasters were treated with the same polished optimism. This emotional neutrality distinguished him from figures like Three Dog or Julie, whose voices evolved alongside experience. Mr. New Vegas existed outside growth. He did not learn. He did not reflect. He reassured. This absence of development was both strength and limitation. For listeners seeking comfort, the predictability was soothing. The radio became a stable presence in a volatile environment. For those listening closely, the lack of genuine response hinted at artificiality. The voice did not process events, it reframed them. Mr. New Vegas also functioned as an intermediary between the region's complexity and its inhabitants. He translated chaos into digestible narrative, reducing ambiguity through tone rather than explanation. The radio did not ask listeners to engage critically, it asked them to relax. In doing so, it subtly discouraged reflection. The authority of Mr. New Vegas came not from command or ideology, but from familiarity. His voice became part of daily routine. Travelers recognized his cadence instantly. Settlements tuned in habitually. Over time, the radio's presence shaped expectations. The Mojave might be dangerous, but the voice on the air was always calm. This calmness carried implicit messaging. If the radio sounded untroubled, perhaps the situation was manageable. If the host expressed confidence, perhaps there was no need to worry. Mr. New Vegas did not issue directives, yet his tone influenced perception. Reassurance became a form of soft control. Unlike authoritarian broadcasts, Mr. New Vegas did not demand obedience. He offered comfort without obligation. This made his influence subtle and difficult to resist. Listeners were not coerced, they were soothed. The radio did not override agency, it dulled urgency. In the broader Fallout radio landscape, Mr. New Vegas represents the evolution of pre-war entertainment into post-war pacification. His broadcasts preserved the sound of confidence without the substance behind it. The voice remained pleasant even when the future was uncertain. The artificial nature of Mr. New Vegas also reflected the Mojave's relationship with power. Much of the region's stability rested on systems that functioned without transparency. Machines ran casinos. Infrastructure persisted without explanation. The radio fit seamlessly into this pattern. It worked. That was enough. For many, Mr. New Vegas became inseparable from the Mojave itself. His voice defined the region's emotional texture as much as its geography. The desert felt less hostile with him speaking into it, even if that feeling was carefully manufactured. In the end, Mr. New Vegas did not lie. He simply omitted. He offered optimism without context, certainty without accountability. His radio presence demonstrates how easily comfort can replace understanding, and how readily listeners accept reassurance when the alternative is uncertainty. Mr. New Vegas remains one of the most enduring voices of the wasteland, not because he spoke truth, but because he spoke calmly. In a world fractured by conflict, that calm carried its own power. High above the Mojave, where broken satellite dishes and rusted towers crowned a jagged peak, a radio signal spilled downward with a tone unlike any other in the wasteland. Black Mountain Radio did not offer comfort, reassurance, or calm. It shouted, argued, and unraveled itself openly across the airwaves. The station reflected not a community, but an isolated mind struggling to impose order on chaos through volume and repetition. The voice behind Black Mountain Radio belonged to Tabitha, a super mutant whose authority rested on proximity to the transmitter rather than consensus. Her broadcasts were erratic, emotionally charged, and deeply personal. She did not speak to an audience she understood. She spoke to an imagined one, shaped by loneliness and resentment. The radio became her stage, her court, and her only reliable means of asserting control. Tabitha's use of radio differed fundamentally from faction broadcasts. She did not claim ideological legitimacy or historical continuity. Her authority was immediate and territorial. Black Mountain was hers, and the radio made that ownership audible far beyond the mountain's slopes. Anyone who heard the signal was reminded that this space was claimed, guarded, and unstable. The tone of the broadcasts fluctuated wildly. Moments of confidence dissolved into paranoia. Commands were issued and contradicted. Insults gave way to frustration and self-justification. The radio did not conceal these shifts, it magnified them. Listeners heard a mind attempting to maintain dominance through sound alone, even as that dominance fractured internally. Music on Black Mountain Radio served a different function than elsewhere in the Mojave. Songs were often introduced abruptly, without explanation or smooth transition. They interrupted rants or followed them without resolution. Rather than soothing or contextualizing emotion, the music highlighted instability. It filled space without coherence, reinforcing the sense that the broadcast was driven by impulse rather than intention. Tabitha frequently spoke of betrayal, incompetence, and imagined enemies. Her commentary revealed an obsession with order defined solely by obedience. The radio became an extension of this obsession. Through it, she demanded loyalty from those who could not hear her directly and punished dissent verbally, even when no one responded. The broadcast assumed an audience that existed only in her perception. The presence of Rhonda, the robotic assistant who occasionally attempted to moderate Tabitha's behavior, added another layer to the station's dynamic. Rhonda's calm, procedural voice contrasted sharply with Tabitha's volatility. When Rhonda spoke, the radio briefly resembled something structured, yet these moments only emphasized how fragile that structure was. The machine offered reminders and corrections, but it could not alter Tabitha's emotional trajectory. Black Mountain Radio demonstrated how radio could become a feedback loop rather than a bridge. Instead of connecting Tabitha to others, it reinforced her isolation. She spoke, heard her own voice amplified, and mistook that echo for authority. Without listeners to respond, the radio became a mirror reflecting her fears and frustrations back at her. For travelers in the Mojave, encountering Black Mountain Radio was often unsettling. The broadcast felt intrusive, aggressive, and unpredictable. Unlike New Vegas's smooth reassurance, or Mojave Music Radio's neutrality, this station demanded attention. It intruded on the listener's mental space, creating tension rather than easing it. Turning it off felt like an act of relief. The station also served as an auditory warning. Long before Black Mountain came into view, the radio announced danger. The tone alone signaled that something was wrong. The broadcast became an early indicator of the instability ahead, preparing listeners psychologically for confrontation. In this way, Black Mountain Radio functioned as environmental storytelling through sound. Tabitha's insistence on broadcasting revealed a deeper need for recognition. Stripped of belonging and understanding, she used the radio to assert existence. The signal said, again and again, that she was there, that she mattered, that others should listen. In the absence of mutual communication, the act of speaking became an end in itself. Unlike authoritarian leaders who used radio to project control through calm, Tabitha projected control through volume and repetition. She believed dominance required constant reinforcement. Silence felt threatening. The radio could not be allowed to rest, because rest invited doubt. Broadcasting became compulsion. This compulsive use of radio underscored the psychological cost of isolation. Black Mountain was physically elevated, but socially cut off. The radio bridged distance without closing it. It extended Tabitha's voice while leaving her unheard. The more she spoke, the clearer it became that no one was answering. The station's instability mirrored the broader instability of supermutant society in the Mojave. Without shared goals or coherent leadership, authority was enforced through force and intimidation. Radio amplified this dynamic. It replaced conversation with command, reflection with accusation. When Black Mountain Radio fell silent, the absence was immediate and noticeable. The sudden quiet did not signal peace so much as release. The air felt less crowded. The Mojave regained its openness. The radio's silence marked the end of a voice that had dominated space without offering connection. In the larger context of Fallout Radio, Black Mountain Radio stands as a cautionary example. It shows what happens when communication is used solely to assert self-importance rather than to connect. The medium that elsewhere fostered community or comfort became a tool of self-reinforcement and psychological unraveling. Tabitha did not misunderstand radio's power. She felt it instinctively. She knew that being heard meant existing. What she lacked was the ability to listen in return. Black Mountain Radio became the sound of that imbalance, broadcast endlessly until silence finally returned. In a world where radio often served as a lifeline, Black Mountain Radio revealed its darker potential. Sound can isolate as easily as it can connect. A voice can fill the air without reaching anyone. And sometimes, the loudest broadcasts speak most clearly of loneliness. In the Mojave, two radio signals often occupied the same airspace while serving entirely different purposes. Mojave Music Radio and Radio New Vegas shared similar playlists, drawn from the same pre-war recordings, yet the experience of listening to each could not have been more distinct. The difference was not in the songs themselves, but in how those songs were framed, contextualized, and emotionally shaped by the presence or absence of a voice. Mojave Music Radio presented music without commentary, allowing tracks to exist on their own. The station offered no interpretation, no emotional guidance, and no acknowledgement of events unfolding across the region. The listener was left alone with the sound, free to attach personal meaning or none at all. In this silence, the music blended seamlessly with the Mojave's vastness. It neither competed with nor softened the landscape. It accompanied it. Radio New Vegas, by contrast, transformed the same music into something curated and purposeful. Mr. New Vegas's commentary created narrative continuity between tracks, turning individual songs into part of a larger emotional arc. His voice framed the music as reassurance rather than reflection. Where Mojave Music Radio allowed listeners to drift inward, Radio New Vegas gently guided them outward, shaping perception through tone. This contrast reflected two philosophies of radio use. Mojave Music Radio treated sound as environment. It existed to fill space without directing thought. Radio New Vegas treated sound as experience. It guided emotions subtly, smoothing over discomfort through warmth and optimism. Both approaches relied on familiarity, but they offered different kinds of comfort. The absence of a DJ on Mojave Music Radio preserved ambiguity. Listeners could not infer intent beyond the act of broadcasting itself. The station did not claim relevance or authority. It simply existed. This neutrality allowed it to feel timeless, disconnected from factional conflict. It did not age with events because it did not respond to them. Radio New Vegas aged differently. Its commentary referenced ongoing developments, even if only superficially. Mr. New Vegas acknowledged changes without allowing them to disrupt his tone. The station evolved in presentation, if not in philosophy. This responsiveness made it feel more alive, but also more constructed. The radio acknowledged the world while insulating listeners from its harsher edges. The emotional impact of each station depended largely on the listener's state of mind. Those seeking solitude and introspection gravitated toward Mojave Music Radio. Its silence respected emotional complexity. Those seeking reassurance gravitated toward Radio New Vegas. Its voice reduced uncertainty through consistency. Neither approach was inherently superior. Each met different needs within the same landscape. This duality also mirrored the Mojave's political tension. The region balanced between independence and control, reflection and reassurance. Mojave Music Radio aligned with the desert's indifference. Radio New Vegas aligned with the illusion of stability offered by systems that persisted despite fragility. The same song could feel mournful on Mojave Music Radio and comforting on Radio New Vegas, depending on framing. Without commentary, lyrics lingered. With commentary, they resolved. The difference lay not in sound, but in interpretation. Radio demonstrated how context shapes meaning as powerfully as content. Listeners often switched between the two stations without fully articulating why. The choice was intuitive, guided by mood rather than logic. The radio became a tool for emotional regulation, allowing individuals to select not just music, but perspective. Over time, this contrast deepened the Mojave's auditory identity. The desert was not defined by a single voice, but by the coexistence of silence and reassurance. Radio did not dictate how the region should feel. It offered options. In the broader Fallout radio landscape, the relationship between Mojave Music Radio and Radio New Vegas illustrates how subtle shifts in presentation can transform identical material into distinct experiences. One station trusted the listener to find meaning, the other supplied it gently. Together, they demonstrated that radio's power lies not only in what is broadcast, but in how much is left unsaid. As the wasteland fractured into territories claimed by competing powers, radio became more than background sound. It became an extension of faction identity, a way for groups to project who they were without constant physical presence. Through tone, silence, and selective broadcasting, factions revealed their priorities as clearly as any uniform or banner. What they chose to transmit, and what they chose to withhold, spoke volumes. For some factions, radio was an opportunity to assert legitimacy. Broadcasts emphasized order, history, and continuity, framing the faction as a stabilizing force amid chaos. These signals often relied on structured language and formal tone, echoing pre-war institutions even when those institutions no longer existed. The radio did not merely inform, it declared intent. To hear the signal was to know that someone claimed responsibility for the land. Other factions rejected radio almost entirely. Silence became a statement. Groups like the Legion did not rely on broadcasts to spread influence. Their identity was enforced through direct encounter, ritual, and fear, rather than communication at a distance. The absence of a Legion radio presence reinforced their philosophy. Authority did not need to explain itself. It arrived in person, undeniable and immediate. Radio, with its distance and abstraction, conflicted with this worldview. The New California Republic occupied a middle ground. NCR broadcasts, where they existed, reflected bureaucracy and expansion rather than charisma. Messages focused on logistics, law, and administration. The tone was procedural, sometimes dull, and often impersonal. This reflected a faction attempting to recreate statehood through systems rather than spectacle. Radio was a tool for coordination, not inspiration. It mirrored the NCR's strengths and weaknesses, projecting structure while revealing emotional distance. The Brotherhood of Steel's relationship with radio was similarly restrained. Their broadcasts were limited, controlled, and often technical. Information was shared on a need-to-know basis. The Brotherhood valued knowledge as power and guarded it carefully. Radio served practical purposes, such as coordination and alerts, but was rarely used to engage the wider population. Silence protected secrecy. What little was transmitted carried authority through precision rather than volume. Smaller factions used radio differently. For independent settlements and minor groups, broadcasting could establish presence without inviting confrontation. A simple signal, even without extensive commentary, announced existence. It told others that a place was inhabited, defended, and organized enough to maintain a transmitter. In this way, radio became a claim of survival rather than dominance. Faction identity also emerged through music choice. Stations aligned with certain groups favored songs that reinforced their worldview. Aggressive or distorted soundscapes reflected cultures built around violence. Neutral playlists signaled detachment or independence. Even when factions did not speak directly, their influence shaped what was heard. The way factions addressed listeners further revealed their priorities. Some spoke to the wasteland as a population to be guided. Others addressed only their own members, treating outsiders as irrelevant or hostile. To be included in the broadcast's intended audience was to be recognized. To be ignored was to be excluded. In regions where multiple factions competed, overlapping signals created a contested soundscape. Different messages bled into one another, sometimes literally through interference. The radio became a battlefield of perception rather than territory. Listeners navigated these signals as carefully as they navigated physical danger, choosing which voices to trust and which to avoid. Faction radio also influenced morale. Hearing a familiar signal could reassure members far from headquarters. It reinforced belonging. Conversely, hearing an enemy broadcast could provoke fear or defiance. Radio allowed factions to extend psychological presence far beyond their patrol routes. A voice could reach places weapons could not. The persistence of faction broadcasts depended on resources and stability. Signals rose and fell as groups gained or lost power. A strong signal implied supply lines, energy, and technical skill. A fading one suggested decline. In this way, radio acted as an indicator of faction health, audible evidence of endurance or collapse. Importantly, faction identity expressed through radio was rarely static. As groups evolved, their broadcasts shifted subtly, tone hardened or softened, music selections changed, silence replaced speech, or vice versa. These changes reflected internal transformations that might not yet be visible on the ground. In contrast to individual broadcasters whose voices carried personal journeys, faction radio emphasized collective identity. The individual disappeared behind the message. Even when a single voice spoke, it did so as representative rather than self. This distinction shaped how listeners responded. Personal broadcasts invited empathy. Faction broadcasts invited alignment or resistance. The existence of faction radio underscores how communication shapes power in the wasteland. Control was not exercised solely through force, but through narrative. Radio allowed factions to define themselves continuously, reinforcing ideology through repetition and presence. It normalized authority by making it audible. At the same time, radio exposed faction limitations. Groups that relied too heavily on rigid messaging struggled to adapt. Broadcasts that failed to acknowledge changing conditions lost credibility. Inflexible voices became echoes rather than guides. In the broader Fallout world, radio as faction identity reveals that survival alone does not define power. Perception matters. Being heard matters. Whether through confident speech, careful silence, or selective music, factions told the wasteland who they were long before they were seen. The airwaves became a map of influence drawn in sound rather than lines. To tune in was to learn not just where you were, but whose world you were passing through. Among the many voices that carried across the wasteland, few were as unsettling in their calm conviction as those associated with the Children of Atom. Their broadcasts did not resemble traditional radio programming. There were no playlists, no structured announcements, and no attempt to entertain. Instead, the airwaves carried sermons, chants, and reverent invocations spoken with unwavering certainty. Radio, for the Children of Atom, was not a medium of information, it was a vessel of faith. The Children of Atom believed radiation was not a curse, but a sacred force. Through radio, they spread this belief beyond the boundaries of their irradiated sanctuaries. The broadcasts did not seek to persuade through argument. They assumed truth and spoke from it. Listeners were not invited to question. They were invited to submit. The tone of these broadcasts was measured and deliberate. Voices spoke slowly, often repeating phrases or names with ritualistic precision. This repetition created a hypnotic effect, drawing listeners into a cadence that felt ancient despite its modern delivery. The radio transformed religious ritual into something omnipresent, allowing worship to occur anywhere within range of the signal. Unlike faction broadcasts that emphasized power or legitimacy, the Children of Atom emphasized transcendence. Their messages framed suffering as purification and exposure as enlightenment. Radio allowed these ideas to reach those who might never willingly approach an irradiated shrine. The airwaves carried doctrine into safer regions, challenging conventional survival instincts with promises of spiritual reward. Music, when present, was minimal and secondary. The focus remained on voice and invocation. Silence between chants was as meaningful as the words themselves. These pauses reinforced solemnity and anticipation. The broadcast did not rush. It unfolded with patience, mirroring the faith's emphasis on inevitability rather than urgency. For many listeners, encountering a Children of Atom broadcast was deeply disorienting. The messages inverted everything survival taught. Where radio elsewhere warned of radiation, these voices welcomed it. Where others sought shelter, these broadcasts spoke of exposure as blessing. The calm delivery made the content more unsettling. There was no hysteria or fanaticism in tone, only certainty. The radio also served as a tool of cohesion within the faith. Hearing shared chants reinforced collective identity. Especially for followers scattered across dangerous terrain, the broadcast created a sense of unity without physical gathering. Even isolated adherents could participate in ritual through sound alone. The Children of Atom's use of radio also highlighted how belief systems adapted to post-war conditions. The sacred space existed wherever the signal reached. This adaptability allowed the faith to persist and spread despite environmental hostility. Unlike authoritarian broadcasts that demanded obedience through threat, the Children of Atom appealed through meaning. They offered an explanation for suffering that reframed fear as purpose. Radio amplified this appeal by removing physical barriers. The listener could engage with the doctrine without immediate risk, allowing ideas to take root quietly. At the same time, the broadcasts revealed the danger of absolute belief. The certainty expressed left no room for doubt or dialogue. Radio became a one-way channel for doctrine, reinforcing hierarchy rather than conversation. Those who listened were positioned as seekers or unbelievers, not equals. The persistence of these broadcasts depended on the same factors as any other station: power, protection, and access to transmitters. That the Children of Atom maintained radio presence demonstrated their organizational strength. Their faith was not passive. It was structured, sustained, and intentional. For outsiders, the broadcasts often functioned as warnings rather than invitations. Hearing the chants drifting through static signaled proximity to irradiated zones and fanatical communities. Radio became an auditory marker of danger, guiding movement through sound as much as sight. In the broader fallout radio landscape, the Children of Atom represent the fusion of faith and frequency. They demonstrate that radio's influence extends beyond politics and culture into belief itself. Sound can sanctify as easily as it can soothe or command. The Children of Atom did not use radio to preserve the past or promise a conventional future. They used it to reinterpret the present. Through the airwaves, they declared that the world had already been transformed, and that survival was not merely biological, but spiritual. Their broadcasts remind listeners that in the wasteland, meaning is as contested as territory. Radio carries not only music and messages, but entire ways of understanding existence. And for those who believe the glow is sacred, the signal itself becomes a form of worship, traveling invisibly through the very radiation they revere. Beyond organized factions and established settlements, the wasteland's airwaves were also claimed by voices that answered to no authority at all. Pirate radio stations emerged wherever individuals found the means and the will to broadcast without permission. These signals were often short-lived, improvised, and unpredictable, yet they played a significant role in shaping local culture. Pirate radio was not about power or preservation. It was about expression. Unlike faction broadcasts, pirate stations rarely followed consistent schedules or formats. A signal might appear for a few hours, vanish for days, then return without warning. This impermanence was part of their identity. Broadcasting itself was an act of defiance, a declaration that the airwaves were not owned by governments, factions, or institutions. Anyone who could build an antenna and find power could speak. The tone of pirate radio varied widely. Some broadcasts were playful, irreverent, and humorous. Others were angry, experimental, or deeply personal. Without the expectation of longevity, broadcasters felt free to say what they wanted without refinement. The radio became a space for raw thought, unconstrained by tradition or responsibility. Music choices reflected this freedom. Pirate stations often mixed genres, eras, and styles without regard for cohesion. Pre-war songs played alongside improvised recordings, local performances, or distorted soundscapes created with scavenged equipment. The result was chaotic, but alive. Each broadcast carried the sense that it might never happen again. For listeners, encountering a pirate signal could feel like discovery. There was no guarantee of clarity or quality. Static and interference were common, yet these imperfections enhanced the sense of authenticity. The radio did not feel curated, it felt inhabited. Pirate radio also served as a platform for voices that had nowhere else to go. Individuals without settlements, protection, or faction affiliation could use the airwaves to tell stories, vent frustration, or share warnings. These broadcasts did not reach wide audiences, but they reached those who happened to be listening. Connection occurred by chance rather than design. The lack of oversight made pirate radio dangerous as well. False information, threats, or erratic messaging could spread without accountability. A broadcast might incite fear or provoke conflict before disappearing. The airwaves offered no guarantee of truth. Trust was provisional, based on tone rather than verification. Despite these risks, pirate radio filled a gap left by more structured stations. Where faction broadcasts felt imposed and community stations felt limited, pirate signals felt free. They reminded listeners that the wasteland was not defined solely by dominant voices. Creativity and dissent still existed. Pirate radio also challenged the idea that radio required stability. These stations proved that broadcasting could exist without permanence. A single transmission could matter, even if it never repeated. The value lay in the act of speaking, not in building legacy. For some broadcasters, pirate radio was performance. For others, it was confession. Without expectation of response, the microphone became a space to articulate thoughts that might otherwise remain unspoken. The radio allowed expression without confrontation. The reaction to pirate stations varied. Some settlements attempted to silence them, viewing unregulated broadcasts as threats to order. Others tolerated them as background noise. In regions with strong faction control, pirate radio became increasingly rare, pushed to the margins by surveillance and suppression. Yet wherever infrastructure decayed and oversight weakened, pirate radio resurfaced. It thrived in gaps. Abandoned towers, forgotten repeaters, and improvised transmitters became opportunities. The airwaves, like the land, resisted complete control. In the broader fallout radio landscape, pirate radio represents the persistence of individual voice. It stands in contrast to institutional messaging and curated nostalgia. These broadcasts do not ask to be trusted or remembered. They ask to be heard, even briefly. Pirate radio reminds listeners that radio's original promise was accessibility. Before it became regulated and commodified, it was a means for ordinary people to speak across distance. In the wasteland, that promise returned in fragmented form. These stations rarely lasted, but their impact lingered. For those who heard them, the memory of an unexpected voice carried weight. It suggested that beyond factions and settlements, people still experimented, still created, still resisted silence. In a world where so much was inherited from the past, pirate radio represented something new. It did not preserve old culture or enforce ideology. It existed in the moment, fleeting and imperfect. And in that impermanence, it captured a different kind of survival, one defined not by endurance, but by expression. Along the fog-choked coastline of Far Harbor, radio behaved differently than it did anywhere else. Signals did not travel cleanly. Sound was swallowed, bent, and distorted by distance, weather, and terrain. What little reached the air felt fragile, as though it might dissolve at any moment into the hiss of static. In this place, radio did not conquer silence. It struggled against it. Far Harbor's isolation shaped every aspect of its soundscape. The settlement existed at the edge of survivability, surrounded by toxic fog that erased landmarks and disoriented even experienced travelers. Radio signals weakened quickly here, fading in and out as the fog thickened. This instability made broadcasts feel temporary and uncertain, reinforcing the sense that nothing in Far Harbor could be relied upon for long. Unlike major settlements, Far Harbor did not develop a strong, personality-driven radio identity. There was no charismatic DJ guiding listeners through daily life, no confident voice offering reassurance. Instead, radio in the region functioned primarily as background presence. When music or sound did appear, it felt incidental rather than intentional, as though it had drifted in from somewhere else rather than being sent deliberately. This lack of a dominant radio voice mirrored the community's emotional state. Far Harbor was not a place of optimism or ambition. It was a place of endurance. The people who lived there focused on survival from day to day, navigating a constant threat that could not be reasoned with or controlled. Radio, in this context, offered little guidance. It could not explain the fog or predict its movements. It could only exist alongside it. The fog itself shaped how radio was perceived. Static blended seamlessly with the sound of wind and surf. At times, it was difficult to distinguish interference from environmental noise. The radio became part of the landscape rather than separate from it. Sound no longer dominated space, it merged with it. When broadcasts did cut through clearly, the effect was often unsettling. Familiar songs played against an unfamiliar backdrop, their warmth clashing with the oppressive environment. Music that might have felt comforting elsewhere took on a hollow quality here. The radio did not dispel fear, it highlighted it by contrast. Far Harbor's relationship with radio was also influenced by its fractured alliances. The region balanced fragile truces between humans, synths, and the children of Atom. No single group held uncontested control of infrastructure. This prevented the emergence of a unified broadcast voice. Any attempt to dominate the airwaves risked destabilizing an already tense balance. As a result, radio remained understated. It did not announce authority or identity. It did not attempt to shape belief. It existed quietly, almost reluctantly. The airwaves reflected the region's collective hesitation, its awareness that asserting too much control invited consequences beyond understanding. For travelers arriving by sea, the absence of a strong radio signal was immediately noticeable. Approaching Far Harbor felt like moving out of range of civilization itself. The gradual loss of familiar broadcasts marked transition more clearly than any signpost. The radio faded, and with it, the sense of connection to the wider Commonwealth. This fading had psychological impact. Without radio to provide continuity, individuals were forced inward. Decisions carried more weight. Isolation became more pronounced. The radio's weakness reinforced the idea that Far Harbor was a place apart, governed by rules that did not apply elsewhere. In moments when radio did manage to break through the fog, it felt less like companionship and more like intrusion. Sound carried across the water unnaturally, appearing where it did not belong. This unpredictability kept listeners on edge. The radio could not be trusted to remain consistent, and so it could not become background comfort. The absence of radio guidance also meant that Far Harbor relied heavily on local knowledge, passed directly between people. Word of mouth mattered more than broadcast. This reinforced close-knit social structures, but also limited perspective. Without broader information flow, misunderstandings festered. Radio, which elsewhere connected distant communities, could not perform that role here. Far Harbor's environment challenged the assumption that radio naturally brought order. Here, the land resisted being mapped or managed through sound. The fog disrupted signals as effectively as it disrupted vision. Technology could not overcome geography. The radio's weakness was a reminder that some environments could not be tamed. For the children of Atom, this resistance held spiritual meaning. The fog was sacred, and radio interference could be interpreted as divine presence rather than technical failure. Sound distortion became another way the land asserted itself, shaping belief through experience rather than instruction. The synth refuge of Acadia approached radio with caution as well. In this context, radio was something to be minimized rather than embraced. Broadcasting openly risked revealing location and intent. The safest signal was the one that barely existed. Over time, Far Harbor's muted radio landscape became part of its identity. The absence of strong broadcasts reinforced the region's emotional tone. Quiet here was not peaceful. It was watchful. The radio did not fill that quiet. It respected it, or was forced to. In the broader Fallout radio landscape, Far Harbor stands as a reminder that radio's power has limits. Not every place can be reached easily. Not every silence can be filled. The airwaves bend to environment as much as to intention. Far Harbor's radio experience is defined less by what is heard than by what is lost. Signals weaken, voices disappear, static overtakes melody. The radio does not guide the listener through the fog. It fades alongside them, leaving only wind, water, and the knowledge that some places remain beyond the reach of sound. Across every region of the wasteland, radio served as more than communication or background sound. It became a container for memory. Long after photographs faded and stories fragmented, songs and familiar voices carried emotional weight that outlasted physical evidence of the past. Radio preserved not facts, but feelings, allowing memory to persist even when context was lost. For survivors who lived through the Great War, hearing pre-war music triggered recollection in ways no other medium could. A melody could summon images of kitchens, cars, storefronts, and conversations that no longer existed. These memories were not always precise. They blended with imagination and loss. Radio did not preserve the past accurately. It preserved it emotionally. This emotional preservation mattered because memory in the wasteland was unstable. Settlements rose and fell. People moved constantly. Written records decayed or were hoarded. Radio, by contrast, traveled freely. A song, heard in one place, could be heard again hundreds of miles away. Memory became portable, carried invisibly through air. For those born after the war, radio created memories that were not truly their own. Children grew up associating certain songs with safety, routine, or companionship without knowing their origin. The music became woven into identity despite lacking historical grounding. In this way, radio shaped generational memory, creating emotional inheritance without explanation. This process blurred the boundary between nostalgia and invention. Listeners remembered feelings without understanding why they existed. A cheerful tune might evoke comfort even when the lyrics described a world no one remembered living in. Radio filled emotional gaps left by history's collapse. Memory through radio was also selective. Certain songs survived because they were recorded, stored, and broadcast repeatedly. Others vanished entirely. This uneven preservation reshaped cultural memory, elevating some voices while erasing others. The past that endured through radio was incomplete, curated by chance as much as intention. Repetition played a crucial role. Hearing the same songs again and again reinforced familiarity. Over time, repetition transformed novelty into ritual. Radio did not need variety to sustain memory. It relied on consistency. Familiar sound became emotional anchor. This anchoring effect helped survivors cope with uncertainty. When everything else changed, radio remained recognizable. The memory it carried was stable, even if inaccurate. That stability offered reassurance in a world defined by flux. Radio also allowed memory to be shared silently. Two strangers could listen to the same song and feel a moment of connection without speaking. The radio created communal memory without requiring community. Shared sound substituted for shared experience. In contrast to written history, radio memory was not linear. Songs surfaced out of sequence, announcements repeated without timeline. The past arrived fragmented, looping, and unresolved. This mirrored how trauma was processed in the wasteland. Memory did not progress neatly, it resurfaced unexpectedly. The emotional weight of radio memory was not always comforting. Some songs triggered grief, reminding listeners of people and places that no longer existed. Others highlighted the contrast between optimism and ruin. Radio preserved joy alongside sorrow, refusing to separate them. Over time, listeners learned to associate certain stations with specific emotional states. One signal meant safety, another meant solitude, another meant danger. Radio mapped memory onto geography, turning sound into orientation. This mapping influenced how regions were remembered. The capital wasteland carried the memory of resistance and moral judgment through Galaxy News Radio. The Mojave carried the memory of open distance through music and calm voices. Appalachia carried the memory of absence through silence and automation. Radio shaped not just memory of events, but memory of place. Even authoritarian broadcasts became part of memory. Hearing a familiar command or polished announcement reminded listeners of power structures that once governed their lives. These memories could inspire fear, resentment, or comfort depending on experience. Radio did not choose which memories endured. It transmitted all of them. As years passed, radio memory began to replace lived experience entirely. Stories were told based on what had been heard, rather than what had been seen. Songs became reference points for history. Memory became mediated. This mediation altered identity. People defined themselves not only by where they lived or what they survived, but by what they listened to. Radio preferences became emotional markers, subtle signals of worldview and experience. In the wasteland, forgetting was as dangerous as remembering. Radio helped prevent total erasure. It ensured that something endured, even if distorted. Memory carried through sound was imperfect, but it was resilient. Radio did not preserve truth, it preserved continuity. And in a world where continuity had been shattered, that preservation mattered more than accuracy. Through radio, the wasteland remembered itself, not as it was, but as it felt. In the Fallout world, radio does not exist solely as part of the environment. It exists in direct relationship with the listener. The act of tuning in is a choice, repeated constantly, often without conscious thought. Through this choice, the listener becomes part of the broadcast's meaning. Radio is not merely heard, it is accompanied. As the listener moves through ruined cities, deserts, and coastlines, radio becomes a steady presence that frames experience. Combat, exploration, travel, and rest all occur against a chosen soundscape. This pairing alters perception. A dangerous road feels different when accompanied by a familiar song. Silence feels heavier when the radio is turned off deliberately. The listener shapes the world as much as the world shapes the listener. Unlike scripted events or fixed environments, radio is portable. It follows the listener rather than remaining anchored to a location. This mobility makes it intimate. The voice on the air seems to speak directly into private moments, even when those moments are shared with no one. Radio becomes a personal layer placed over the wasteland, filtering experience through tone and rhythm. This relationship gives the listener agency over emotional pacing. Tuning into a calm station can soften tension. Switching to silence can heighten awareness. Choosing an aggressive broadcast can amplify unease. The radio becomes an emotional instrument, adjusted instinctively to match or counter the environment. The listener's awareness of radio personalities deepens this effect. Voices like Three Dog, Travis, Julie, or Mr. New Vegas feel familiar over time. Their greetings mark the start of journeys. Their silence marks transition. Even automated stations acquire character through repetition. The listener learns their patterns, anticipates their rhythms, and notices when they change or disappear. This familiarity creates attachment. The radio becomes a companion rather than a tool. Turning it off can feel like losing company. Leaving a region where a favored signal fades can feel like departure from something known. Radio transforms geography into emotional territory. The listener's actions also interact with radio in subtle ways. In some regions, broadcasts respond indirectly to events. Hearing acknowledgement, praise, or condemnation creates feedback. The world feels reactive, even when the radio does not change. The listener projects meaning onto it, interpreting songs and silence through recent experience. This projection is key. Radio does not need to speak directly to influence interpretation. A cheerful song following violence can feel ironic or hollow. A calm voice after chaos can feel reassuring or disturbing. Meaning emerges through contrast, shaped by the listener's state of mind. The listener's control over radio also reflects broader themes of fallout. Choice exists, but within constraints. Stations are limited, signals fade. Not every voice is available everywhere. The listener selects from what remains, navigating scarcity through preference. Over time, radio habits form. Certain stations become default choices for travel, others for rest. These habits shape memory. Looking back, moments are remembered not only for what happened, but for what was playing. Sound becomes part of narrative recall. The radio also influences pacing of attention. Listening allows the mind to drift while the body remains alert. This dual state mirrors survival in the wasteland, where vigilance and reflection coexist. The radio occupies cognitive space that might otherwise fill with anxiety or monotony. Importantly, the listener is never required to listen. Radio can be silenced entirely. This absence is meaningful. Choosing silence often signals heightened tension, reflection, or emotional weight. The lack of sound sharpens awareness of environment. The listener becomes more exposed. This choice highlights radio's role as emotional buffer. When on, it absorbs some of the wasteland's harshness. When off, the rawness returns. The listener controls this threshold, moving between immersion and protection. The radio's persistence also affects how danger is perceived. Threats feel less overwhelming when framed by familiar sound. At the same time, danger can feel more surreal when juxtaposed with cheerful music. The listener navigates this dissonance continually. Through repeated use, radio becomes part of identity. Preferences reveal temperament. Choosing news, music, or silence signals how the listener engages with the world. Radio becomes self-expression without speech. This relationship distinguishes Fallout's radio from background sound. It is not passive ambience. It is interactive, shaped by listener choice and experience. The radio does not dictate meaning, it offers texture. In the end, the listener completes the broadcast. Without someone tuning in, radio is just signal. With a listener, it becomes story, memory, and companion. The wasteland speaks through radio, but it is the listener who decides how that voice is heard. There are moments in the wasteland when the radio stops. Not gradually, but completely. A signal fades, static rises, and then there is nothing but wind and distant movement. These moments carry weight far beyond the absence of sound. Silence in Fallout is never neutral. It arrives with meaning shaped by what has been lost. When a radio station goes silent, it often marks the end of something larger. A settlement may have fallen. A transmitter may have lost power. A voice may have been killed, fled, or chosen to stop speaking. In regions where radio has served as reassurance, its absence feels immediate and personal. The listener notices the quiet quickly, sometimes without realizing why. A familiar rhythm is missing. Travel feels longer. The wasteland feels larger. The radio had been doing quiet work, softening isolation without announcing itself. Its absence reveals that work by contrast. Silence can also signal danger. In areas controlled by factions or raiders, a dead signal may indicate violence nearby. A broadcast that once warned or boasted no longer does. The lack of sound becomes information in itself. Experienced travelers learn to listen for what is not there as much as for what is. The emotional effect of radio silence depends on what the station represented. When an authoritarian broadcast ends, the silence may feel like relief. When a community station falls quiet, the silence feels heavier, closer to grief. The radio's role determines how its absence is processed. In some cases, silence is chosen deliberately. A listener may turn the radio off during moments of tension or reflection. This voluntary silence sharpens perception. Footsteps, wind, and distant threats become more pronounced. Without music or voices, the wasteland asserts itself fully. The listener becomes exposed. This choice mirrors survival decisions elsewhere. Comfort is optional, but awareness is necessary. The radio can buffer experience, but it can also distract. Turning it off is an act of attention, a return to immediacy. When a station disappears permanently, the loss becomes part of the region's identity. People remember when it used to be there. Stories circulate about its voice and purpose. The silence becomes historical. What was once sound turns into memory. This transition from broadcast to absence reflects the fragility of post-war civilization. Nothing is guaranteed to last. Signals depend on power, protection, and people willing to maintain them. When those conditions fail, the radio stops without ceremony. The silence left behind often feels unfinished. There is no closing statement or farewell. The broadcast simply ends. This lack of closure mirrors how many lives in the wasteland end, abruptly and without explanation. Radio silence echoes that reality. In areas like Appalachia or Far Harbor, silence dominates from the beginning. There, the absence of radio defines the region. In others, silence arrives later, marking decline rather than origin. The timing changes its meaning, but not its impact. Listeners adapt to silence over time, but they do not forget what filled it before. The memory of sound lingers, making quiet feel occupied by absence. Silence becomes a presence of its own. In Fallout, silence is never empty. It carries the weight of what once spoke and what might never speak again. When all the voices, stations, and signals of the wasteland are considered together, a pattern emerges that extends beyond any single broadcast. Fallout Radio is not merely a collection of songs, personalities, or frequencies. It is a record of how humanity responded to collapse through sound. Each station represents a different answer to the same question. What do you say when the world is broken and someone might be listening? Some chose reassurance. Smooth voices and familiar music promised stability even when none existed. These broadcasts softened fear, offering continuity in tone if not in reality. They did not deny danger, but they reframed it, smoothing sharp edges through confidence and repetition. In doing so, they revealed how deeply people crave calm, even when calm is artificial. Others chose honesty. Fragile voices admitted uncertainty, grief, and exhaustion. These stations did not promise safety or solutions. They offered presence. Their power came not from certainty, but from shared vulnerability. In a wasteland built on survival, simply acknowledging pain became an act of resilience. Some voices sought control. Through polished authority or ritualistic certainty, they used radio to impose order on chaos. Their broadcasts framed obedience as salvation and dissent as threat. These stations demonstrated how easily sound could be weaponized, shaping belief without physical force. Radio allowed power to travel invisibly, asserting dominance without confrontation. Still others used radio for expression alone. Pirate signals flared briefly, carrying raw thought, creativity, or anger before vanishing. These broadcasts left little legacy, but they mattered in the moment. They proved that even without stability or approval, people still sought to speak. There were also places where radio faltered entirely. Fog swallowed signals. Silence dominated. In these regions, the absence of sound became its own message. Not every place could be reached. Not every voice could endure. The limits of radio mirrored the limits of civilization itself. Across all these variations, one truth remained constant. Radio survived because it required less than almost anything else. A little power, a little knowledge, a willingness to speak. It endured because it adapted, reshaping its purpose to match its environment. Where communities existed, radio connected them. Where authority sought control, radio amplified it. Where isolation prevailed, radio echoed absence. Radio also blurred the line between past and present. Pre-war songs carried forward emotions divorced from their origins. Listeners inherited feelings without context, building memory from sound alone. The past did not return accurately. It returned emotionally. This distortion became part of post-war identity, shaping how people understood what had been lost. The personalities behind the microphones mattered, but so did those who listened. Every broadcast was completed by its audience. Meaning did not exist in sound alone. It emerged through interpretation, shaped by fear, hope, exhaustion, and choice. Two people could hear the same song and feel entirely different things. Radio did not dictate response. It invited it. In Fallout, radio becomes a mirror. It reflects the values of those who control it and the needs of those who tune in. It reveals whether a society seeks comfort, control, faith, expression, or silence. The airwaves become a map of human response to catastrophe, drawn in sound rather than borders. Even silence has meaning. When a station goes dark, it marks loss. A voice has disappeared. A place has changed. Silence reminds listeners that nothing in the wasteland is permanent, not even sound. What makes Fallout radio endure is not nostalgia or novelty. It endures because speaking into emptiness is a fundamentally human act. Even when no answer comes, the act itself asserts existence. Someone is still here. Someone still remembers how to speak. In the end, Fallout radio is not about music or messages. It is about presence. A signal crossing ruins, deserts, and fog carries a simple truth. Civilization did not end all at once. It fractured, adapted, and echoed itself forward through voices that refused to vanish quietly. As long as a signal travels and someone listens, the wasteland is not entirely silent. As the airwaves settle and the static softens, the voices of the wasteland linger longer than their words. Each signal, whether strong or fading, leaves an impression shaped not only by what was said, but by the fact that it was said at all. In a world built from ruins and memory, radio becomes proof that connection survived where so much else did not. These broadcasts do not offer a single story. They offer fragments, confidence beside doubt, comfort beside control, silence beside sound. Together, they form a quiet record of how people responded when certainty vanished. Some chose to reassure. Some chose to command. Some chose simply to speak, even without knowing who might be listening. Radio endures because it asks little of those who use it. A voice, a signal, a willingness to remain present. It does not require rebuilding cities or restoring governments. It only requires the belief that communication still matters. That belief carries forward through every song played, every announcement repeated, and every pause left unfilled. As you rest, imagine those signals still traveling, crossing deserts, coasts, and broken streets, moving through fog and silence alike. Somewhere, a radio hums softly. Somewhere, a voice waits between songs. The wasteland continues, shaped not just by survival, but by the quiet persistence of sound.